feel like we've heard similar rhetoric before. Are we getting closer at this point to that being truly a last chance?
No, I think we're caught in a doom loop. We've heard this many times before. President Trump has repeatedly threatened to annihilate Iran, to expand into civilian infrastructure, and then he says, oh, in fact, we're on the verge of a great triumph, so I'm going to stand down for the moment. So I think this is just like every previous time, and it's indication that the U.S. administration really is at an impasse and doesn't know what to do next.
He is saying it's the last chance. I think a lot of people watching this completely agree with what you're saying, Alan. There's a feeling that what he's threatening doesn't really carry that weight, Kirsten. He threatens these massive attacks and then pulls back on them. We saw that over the weekend. I mean, how are you seeing this moment and where we're actually headed and the kind of leverage that he has or does not have?
But remember that the strategy is to economically squeeze Iran with the naval blockade, not to necessarily arrive at a deal immediately and not necessarily to demolish them militarily. So he has to buy the time to apply that squeeze. And what you're watching happen is less about the mediators' activity behind the scenes, which is significant. It's about what each side is intending through their messages right now. The president needs oil prices to stay low. He's under domestic international pressure to do that. That buys him time. As long as oil prices maybe rise a little, come down a little, markets maybe get a little upset, then they calm. That buys him that economic squeeze time. Iran knows that. They know about the pressure he's under. So for them, they want to issue these ultimatums. We are not negotiating. There are no talks happening. They're trying to scare the markets. They're trying to spike oil prices. They're trying to panic economic markets. Because they know that makes that pressure on him worse, they think that will drive him to a deal. He thinks the ultimatums about the military end is coming are what will drive Iranian leaders to a deal because they are not concerned about the welfare of the country or the people. We've established that through ongoing operations. They're really concerned about their hold on power and their ability to leverage it. And so if he erases all of their military power or he goes in after things like the electricity grid, then they no longer have the reins of power. They can no longer exert a pressure on their populations. So they're both saying, we want a way out of this, but we think the way out is to make the other one bend the knee. Economically.
And who has the top there? Because Iran also strategically is not willing to let go of control of the Strait, it seems. Although there's that conversation between Iran and Oman, it's unclear whether that conversation is truly going to be fruitful, especially for other U.S. allies in the region who allegedly called the president asking for him to not attack Iran again this time around over the weekend. So where does that stand? Does Iran basically have hostage of U.S. allies right now with the Strait?
Not necessarily hostage. Remember, it's not necessarily in the U.S. disinterest, if you're the administration, to have them call and make that request. Because being able to say you backed off of a military operation to buy time for a deal gives you more time when that economic squeeze is taking place, is exerting, its impact on the Iranian economy.
Makes you look diplomatic.
Makes you look diplomatic. Well, now he is. He's saying, we're open to this deal. We want the negotiations to happen this afternoon. Is Iran willing to do it? So it puts them in that seat where they're now under international pressure to continue those talks. Because if they decide not to, the U.S. can say, we were pushed to this military decision because they would not make a deal and they were continuing to suffocate the international economy with their insistence on controlling the Strait.
How are you seeing the issue of the Strait right now, Alan, where you have Iran denying it was negotiating, as Trump is really trying to say, yes, they're spending hours negotiating, but Iran saying they're in talks with Oman to establish a safe temporary route for vessels through the Strait. And then you see Saudi Arabia looking for workarounds also to deal with the Houthis. How are you seeing this?
Well, I think in this case, Iran is to be believed. They've realized that it makes no sense to negotiate with the U.S. because the U.S., in their mind, can't be counted on to deliver on their commitments. So the main negotiations going on now are between Iran and the Omanis, with the Omanis consulting with the other Gulf countries. But at least what's clear to me is that this administration doesn't do diplomacy. It doesn't have the foreign policy apparatus. It's too internally inconsistent. So it's outsourced diplomacy to others, to Pakistan and Qatar in the beginning, and now it's wanting to see how the Omanis play out in these negotiations with Iran over the Strait. But the key issue, the only issue, is getting the Strait open as much as possible, as quickly as possible. Because as Kirsten said, I agree 100%, it's a two clocks issue. Pressure on Iranian ports, pressure on the Strait of Hormuz. Unfortunately, this is the one where the alarm's going to go off first. Pressure on the Strait.
President Trump with a new warning for Iran today, an ultimatum as he insists new peace talks are ongoing. Over the weekend, President Trump says he called off a massive attack at the request of Iran and allies in the Middle East, and that his decision was contingent on a proposed deal with Tehran being quickly agreed to. But today, the president made clear his patience is running thin, especially when it comes to the flow of oil export in the Strait of Hormuz.
This is the last chance. This is not something that, if it doesn't happen, this is the last chance for them to sign a good document. I'm not going to let them charge. If anybody's going to charge, we'll charge. We're the one that has total control. We have total control. You know, we have a thing called a blockade with his Navy. And that Navy is, they call it a wall of steel, the United States wall of steel. And no, there's not going to be charging. We're not talking about charging at all. There won't be charging.
The president's announcement of new talks with Iran has oil prices sinking today, despite no indication that Iran was prepared to fully reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Here with me now, the managing director of Clearview Energy Partners, Kevin Book. And Kevin, how is the oil industry viewing this plan by Iran and Oman to establish this safe, temporary route, as they're calling it, for vessels through the strait?
Well, I think most operators in the region and those who work in the region, U.S. companies, foreign companies, don't want to pay more to travel through what would ordinarily be known as innocent passage through territorial waters adjacent to the countries that are proposing to charge fees. That would be a big change. They don't want to do it.
Okay, and then President Trump announcing plans to pause attacks on Iran. We see oil prices tumble 5%, 20%. Why does the oil market continue to believe that Trump, who CNN's David Goldman calls the president who cried peace, why does the oil market continue to react the way it does?
Well, there's a very important role that he plays in deciding whether or not there's going to be an attack. So we have very little information coming out of a war zone. The fog of war is thick. There's a lot of mystery. And so you can track ships, you can look at fundamentals, but a very significant change of the order that the president had been discussing, the biggest attack since World War II, could very easily disable a lot of capacity in the region. Reprisals could disable a lot of capacity. If he says it's off, the market sells off until it learns something else.
So does it react more so on words than action or inaction?
Well, fundamentals matter. There's a lot going on besides what the president says. So oil that doesn't come out of the Strait of Hormuz is a shortage, and that shortage drives up prices. But there's another shortage, a bigger shortage, a shortage of refined products, fuels, gasoline, diesel, the fuel we use. Now, one of the things that's happening is that the oil price isn't going up as much because the refineries that can't get the oil aren't using it. The fuels prices are going up more as a result. You see a divergence in these prices. So there's different prices that are responding in different ways. But look, we're not getting the volume out of the Strait of Hormuz that we were getting before the war. We're not getting the volume we were getting during the MOU days, which means that we're coming back on that moment when inventories are drawing and questions are rising.
Well, despite not having that volume coming out of the strait, prices, the profits for oil companies is something that the president actually talked about just today, not long ago in the Oval Office. What did you make of those comments?
Well, it's been a recurrent theme. Secretary Besant brought it up in April and said that, oil prices are falling, the gasoline and fuel prices should fall too. In June, the president said he wanted to see lower prices. He said it again today. The reality is that the industry isn't causing these prices to go up. Shortage is causing these prices to go up. That is what, in fact, the president said today. And so it is war that is behind this. Now, as for what goes on in the retail, there has never been any evidence found of systematic manipulation of prices at a retail level. And refineries are effectively price takers. And so they're buying crude oil at the global price and selling at sort of the commodity price of the fuels that they produce. So it's very difficult to understand how they could respond to this. But one of the things that they have been watching, that investors have been watching, is whether or not the administration would look at limiting exports, limiting the outflow of fuels from the United States to try to force those prices down. They have said that they wouldn't do that. They said that earlier this year. But as we go further into the summer with high prices, those questions are likely to come up again, Brian.
And we also have the Iranian-backed Houthis in Yemen warning they would target Saudi shipping in the Red Sea. So this has moved beyond just the Strait. What are the impacts there of a potential blockade?
Well, that's the exit valve for a lot of the crude that had been previously going through the Strait of Hormuz. So if the Houthis actually block cargoes going through the Red Sea, through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait that goes into the Gulf of Aden at the bottom of the Red Sea, then those cargoes at minimum have to go north through Suez. They have to offload, if they're large tankers, to the Sumed pipeline, which has pipeline capacity constraints of its own. And then they have to take the route all the way around Africa to get to the Asian markets they previously would have served in relatively short order through Bab el-Mandeb. So that's a pretty significant change if it happens.
And also in the Oval Office today, President Trump seemed to be irked by the profits of some of the oil companies. What did you make of those comments?
Well, you know, it's consistent with what he'd been saying again in June and what the Secretary of the Treasury had been saying in April. The profits coincide with shortage. Oil companies don't usually get a lot of sympathy when they're experiencing significant losses at times of surplus. We as consumers tend to be pretty happy in those times, and we're not out there to complain about that. So it's cyclical. They make investments over the long haul. Prices go up and down, and their profits reflect that.
A CNN exclusive. Sources say the Pentagon is asking U.S. troops for creative and unconventional ideas to punish Iran, essentially crowdsourcing new ways to wage the war President Trump launched now in its 6th month. CNN's Zach Cohen helped break this story and is here now with details. So, Zach, what are you learning about this?
Yeah, sources telling me and our colleague Katie Bo-Lillis that the Pentagon is really trying to cast a wider net as it seeks fresh ideas for how to ramp up the pressure on Iran at this stage in the conflict, which we're told by multiple sources is not inherently a bad idea. This war was stated to only last about 6 weeks, and we're now in the 6th month of the war itself, which has really changed the calculus as far as military planners are concerned. We're told that the U.S. Central Command is really taking a look at its strategy as a whole and trying to reevaluate what it can do to try to push Iran to the negotiating table. And our sources are also saying there that this email, this crowdsourcing email, is a sign of the limited options that President Donald Trump has available to him at this point to try to get Iran to the table on his terms. And that's something that we've seen play out over the course of this conflict, whether it's concerns about the diminishing U.S. munitions stockpile, the fact that even Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Dan Kane, has acknowledged that airstrikes, air power, have their limitations. So these stated objectives that President Trump has laid out since the beginning of the conflict, preventing Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon and even reopening the Strait of Hormuz, has proven more challenging to accomplish with just military might alone. And we're seeing even now Donald Trump giving the Iranians one more chance to make some sort of an initial agreement over the Strait of Hormuz. But in the meantime, we do see military planners really trying to broaden the scope and solicit creative and unconventional ideas for how they can maybe handle the situation going forward.
Certainly an intriguing peek behind the curtain. Obviously, we've reached out to the military on this reporting. What are we hearing?
We reached out to U.S. Central Command about this reporting, and they responded saying, quote, U.S. Central Command has a long history of thinking and working in innovative ways. Admiral Cooper, who runs U.S. Central Command in particular, reaches out to members of our great team, regardless of rank, to achieve the highest levels of operational performance possible. And I want to note, too, that this email was sent just days before President Trump threatened to escalate the conflict. And we know we've talked a lot about concerns that he has heard from his top advisors about what the potential consequences and the potential lack of effectiveness of that escalatory strikes would be. So it's all not happening in a vacuum, but more creative thinking is being encouraged, not just by the senior leaders in the military, but also lower ranks as well.
Tonight, President Trump says he is giving Iran one last chance to sign a deal at the request of America's Gulf allies.
Many countries called, the leaders of many are friendly with a lot of them. Almost all of them, one way or the other, and they all wanted to give this a last chance. This is a last chance. This is not something that, if it doesn't happen, this is a last chance for them to sign a good document.
The president's tone has shifted back and forth multiple times over the last several days. First, he said the two sides had reached the parameters of a deal. After Tehran denied engaging in talks, he accused them this morning of being, quote, extremely duplicitous. Now he seems optimistic once again, suggesting the Strait of Hormuz could open as soon as Tuesday. Kevin Liptak is at the White House. And Kevin, I wonder, the president says one last chance, but as you well know, this is not the first of the deadlines he's issued over the last several weeks and months. Do they back that up? I mean, is he putting any sort of time frame on this?
there's no time frame. In fact, he said specifically that he felt no pressure, including from the midterm elections. So he's not putting a deadline on any of this. We do know, of course, that the military has prepared for this escalation. They've flowed resources to the region, and they say that they're ready for a go order if the president is to give it. But at this point, he is holding off. I think it's interesting to just parse what he's saying is under discussion here. He's saying that there's discussions between the Iranians to try and reopen the Strait of Hormuz. That would be phase one. And phase two would be a discussion of the nuclear program. If that sounds very, very familiar, it's because he's describing almost exactly the memorandum of understanding that he signed at the Palace of Versailles in June, and that he essentially ripped up 2 weeks later, saying that it wasn't even worth the paper that it was printed on. Part of the reason he didn't think it was working is because he didn't think the Iranians were negotiating in good faith. And now he seems to be trying to put in place exactly the same thing with exactly the same Iranians who he still thinks are negotiating in bad faith. So where all of this leads, it's not particularly clear. And it's not even particularly clear where President Trump thinks that it leads, except to some sort of resolution of the conflict. Now, he did hold out the option that this escalation could occur. He called it decapitation. But he said he didn't want to necessarily go down that route because he was worried that it would kill a lot of people. And that does match what we've heard behind the scenes, advisors warning about the potential for civilian casualties. They've obviously also been warning about the prospects of dwindling munitions stockpiles, which I think is a concern not just for the United States, but for the entire region, you know, as the Saudis, as the Emiratis, the Jordanians, the Bahrainis, as they all look at potential retaliation from Iran if the president goes this route. They recognize that the American ability to defend them is also dependent on those munition stockpiles. And so there are a lot of reasons, I think, for the president to hold off here that he was talking about with his advisors all last week. But at least for now, he's allowing the diplomacy continue. But he says this may result in some announcement on the Strait of Hormuz tomorrow. But in terms of a broader agreement that would bring the conflict to an end permanently, it doesn't seem as if we're any closer to that than we were before.
Yeah, and let's be frank, there have been promises about the Strait of Hormuz before. So far, none of them have become a reality. Kevin Liptak at the White House. Well, Iran's strategy of countering U.S. military might with economic pain has exposed a new target in the region, AI data centers. The centers have become critical to the economy and national security of several Gulf nations, and they are often owned by top U.S. tech companies. Iran has now struck several of them, and the U.S. has responded by striking one in Iran. David Goldman is with me now. David, it's an interesting target, right? Because we think of the Gulf as in effect being a one industry region, right? Oil, energy, natural gas, etc. But more and more, it's a tech hub, and these are now economic targets for Iran.
That's right. They're trying to change that, and they're really doubling, tripling down on AI, and Iran has made those a target. I mean, they have targeted 2 data centers in Bahrain. The United States, as you mentioned, targeted 1 in Tehran. The UAE has gotten hit, and so now there are 5 data centers that have been targeted in this war. The Bahrain one is particularly interesting because they were hit twice. First, Iran targeted it close to the beginning of the war on April 30th, and then it said it wasn't done. And just a few weeks ago, July 21st, there was a subsequent attack that basically demolished these Amazon facilities that are in Bahrain. So it's not just Amazon, it's lots of tech companies. Google, Microsoft, NVIDIA, Palantir, all of these are Iranian targets according to the regime. They've actually outlined 29 different targets. They said that these are all legitimate military targets. And why are they legitimate military targets? Well, it's because so many of these companies do have military contracts. In fact, there's a $9 billion military contract that Google and Microsoft and Oracle and Amazon are all participating in. And so they don't differentiate between, in these data centers, whether they're holding U.S. military information or commercial commercial information for things like ChatGPT and other similar AI services for consumers. Those are all held in the same place. Iran says you might as well be putting a big American flag on your roof. They are targets that we can hit. And this is crucial for the Gulf nations because they are all massively investing in AI to differentiate their economies from oil. To your point, we have, Kuwait, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, all of these countries have dedicated a combined $2 trillion in U.S. investments to the exclusion of China, saying that we will invest in your architecture and infrastructure and we will not invest in China. We'll create a third hub in addition to China and Silicon Valley so that investors can put their money here. The big question is if they're going to be military targets, are companies going to continue to build there? Will insurers continue to insure them? And, will they be able to live this dream, Jim?
David Goldman, another vulnerability. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Speaking of AI, a major cybersecurity firm is warning that hackers are moving faster than ever by weaponizing AI. The 2026 Threat Hunting Report by CrowdStrike looks at activity over the past 12 months, ending in June, and it has found that attacks now need to be measured in minutes, not days. CrowdStrike found one campaign that generated almost 200,000 automated requests to an AI system in just 2 minutes, and hackers are targeting the very software and AI tools that businesses rely on most. Adam Myers is CrowdStrike's Senior Vice President of Counter-Adversary Operations. His team tracks criminal, state-sponsored, and national cyber attackers around the world. Adam, good to have you.
Thanks for having me.
So, of course, everybody's using AI, including the bad guys, as you make the point here. Let's begin with how AI helps, because your report says AI is a tool, a target, and a force multiplier. Explain.
Yeah, absolutely. The enterprises are rushing to adopt AI, and we've seen all of the benefits that come from implementing AI across the business to help make things go faster, improve results, get things to customers faster, easier. But adversaries are using AI to also increase speed and to make their jobs easier. We find more and more scripts that are being used by these threat actors to hack into organizations. And we could tell from the scripts that they were written with AI because they're well documented. They have emojis in cases in the comments, and they're much higher fidelity than they had previously been. And of course, we also have AI being targeted. And so that's one of the big challenges we've seen.
You have warned in the past, going back to March, about Iran taking advantage of AI for cyber attacks. At the time, you mentioned specifically the financial services sector, but now you have these attacks on infrastructure here in the U.S. in 6 states, including water systems, and Iran is one of the suspects in that. Do you see Iran as weaponizing AI for cyber attacks?
Not as much in terms of weaponizing AI. I think the Iranian groups that we've been tracking have increased activity, certainly since the start of the conflict, or the escalation of the conflict, I should say. And, I think with these alleged water incidents, this is something we've seen from them before. About a year and a half ago, they targeted a water treatment facility in Pennsylvania and had got access to what we call operational technology systems. These are systems that are used to move things around or increase or decrease the flow of water or pipes, gas pipelines or things like that. And these are systems that should not be connected to the internet. And in previous incidents, we've seen them using default passwords and things like that to gain access.
You mentioned other state actors that do specifically take advantage of AI, including China and North Korea. I mean, they were already formidable players in cyberspace. How much more formidable has this made them?
Well, we see North Korean threat actors literally every day. I think in July, we saw something like 41 incidents of North Koreans using AI in every step of the way to gain jobs, remote IT jobs at Western companies, particularly here in the US. And what that looks like is they use AI to create LinkedIn profiles and resumes to make them attractive to recruiters. We see them using AI during the interview process to answer questions and even change their appearance using deep fake technology. And then finally, using AI to do the job once they gain that employment. All of that meant to generate revenue that goes directly to the weapons program in North Korea. Yeah. On China, we've seen that they're using AI for vulnerability research. And we've seen, and this report details, that China has fielded new vulnerabilities as weapons within 2 days of those vulnerabilities being released, and even as quick as 24 hours. Many organizations have kind of standardized on a 30-day patch cycle. And that's completely obsolete in what we found since really the beginning of this year and the increase in the vulnerability speed. This is something that's a huge challenge for organizations. They need to patch in 24 to 48 hours, not 30 days.
Okay. Now, even before the rapid acceleration of AI, the cyberspace was, as I don't have to tell you, extremely active, and a lot of attacks worked. I just wonder, is AI making existing cyber protections, which were already vulnerable and full of holes, if not obsolete, just much more vulnerable?
No, I think that's actually the good news story, is that we've been implementing AI, and many other companies from a defense perspective have been using AI as a force multiplier. And you mentioned that a few minutes ago. As AI allows security teams to make decisions faster, to keep pace with the adversary, it's actually really helpful. Where we need to be very careful, and one of the things we call out in this report is with AI, specifically something called CI/CD pipelines, or continuous integration, continuous deployment, meaning that as code is being pushed by developers, that gets instantly sucked down and implemented by these systems. And we've seen an increase in supply chain attacks. In fact, in just one day, we saw over 300 supply chain attacks against various dependencies that are being used across that AI ecosystem. So that's a big blind spot that I think organizations are not well aware of.
Right now, President Trump is once again lashing out at Iran just hours before planned talks with the regime. In a new social media post, he called Iran's leadership duplicitous for asking for the talks and then denying the discussions. He said, nothing gets through to Iran unless we want it to, and nothing will get through unless a deal or total surrender is accomplished. He also reiterated his goal of Iran never having a nuclear weapon. With us here in the Situation Room, CNN Global Affairs analyst Kim Dozier and Michael Allen. He's a former special assistant to President George W. Bush for national security. Kim, what do you make, first of all, of the president's latest social media post?
Well, he doesn't like getting called out by the Iranians, who are saying we're in talks with Oman, but not with the United States. This is something that they have consistently stuck to since the Memorandum of Understanding was signed in June, saying that they have not agreed to talks with Washington. So what we have is, once again, we're stuck in Groundhog Day, where President Trump threatens massive strikes, and then we hear Gulf allies intervene because they know whatever strikes the U.S. metes out on Tehran, Tehran has promised to do the same to the much closer Gulf allies. And the allies, they don't want their energy infrastructure, et cetera, hit, and their people are tired of this constant barrage.
Does Iran, Michael, have a serious interest right now in actually finding a diplomatic solution?
I don't think they do. I don't think that they feel like they're in a disadvantageous position right now. I think they feel like they control most of the straits. There are other vessels slipping through the Oman side of the Strait of Hormuz. But in general, I feel like they have a pretty good grip on it. They're not going to negotiate away any leverage that they may have. But there is an X factor, and that is, what is the state of the Iranian economy? We know inflation is 70%. We know that they're in dire straits. But are they so bad off? And I'm not sure we know for sure, nor even the CIA and our intelligence communities, how bad off they are. And if they're in a really horrific position, they may want to negotiate over time to get that blockade going back, but it's hard to say. It's kind of the X factor in an assessment of their attitude.
Over the weekend, Trump posted he was going to launch the largest, most serious military assault of any time since World War II against Iran, but now he's backed off of that once again. The Saudi Crown Prince, as you know, appealed to President Trump to hold off on new strikes. They're obviously concerned about potential retaliation on Saudi Arabia, including its oil operations. How much sway do the Saudis and other regional allies have right now on the president at this moment? The United Arab Emirates, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait.
I think they have a lot of influence over the president. He puts a lot of stock in personal relationships, maybe too much. But I think what the president's overriding objective is to keep oil prices low. That tells me he does care about the outcome of the midterm elections. And so every time he seems to be thinking, I'm going to go more kinetic, or I'm going to do the blockade more than I'm currently doing it, he seems to back down a little bit because he wants to be able to press the markets into a more favorable position. It's great for, I guess, our oil prices here in the United States, but it's terrible strategic messaging for our adversary, the Iranians, who just see an irresolute United States lurching back and forth into positions that honestly not many people can understand or track.
Kim Dozier, is it possible that Iran could be overplaying its hand?
At this point, you know, Iran has several weeks, if not months, before it's going to feel the same kind of economic pain that forced it into signing that memorandum of understanding. At this point, it still has capacity to fill up its oil storage areas. It's still getting some oil out. And unlike Donald Trump, it doesn't care about how the public reacts to rising prices, et cetera. And most of all, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps does not want to hand Donald Trump a win, especially ahead of the midterms. They know how important that is. And that's why I think you're going to see them draw this out at least through that time period. They can go for a while before they start having trouble buying new ammunition, et cetera.
You know, Iran has continued to strike against U.S. and allied targets in the region, big time. Are they getting fresh supplies of weapons from somewhere, or do they still have a deep stockpile?
I think they have some, but I think they also use the pauses in fighting to restock their arsenal. I think we're pretty confident that the Chinese are absolutely sending them, at the very least, dual-use products, probably actual military equipment. And we saw recently that the Russians still have a healthy relationship with Iran. Of course, Ukraine sunk a ship, so we all looked at that, and that reminded us of that relationship. But there's other equipment that gets through. They have a very thick relationship. So I think that not only do they have drones and ballistic missiles buried somewhere that they can use more or less on demand, I think they have more stuff coming in.
And to Michael's point, they don't have to hit with conventional military capability. They are masters at the asymmetric attacks with, we don't know what that explosion was in Damietta in that Egyptian port. There was another explosion near a ship in the Strait of Hormuz today. Nobody claimed that, probably Iran. They only have to do these minor attacks to frustrate major shipping because insurance companies aren't going to insure traffic through something so dangerous, because even one strike has the potential to take out a multi-million-dollar vessel. That is an advantage that the U.S. does not have.
Kimberly Dozier, Michael Allen, to both of you, thank you very, very much. This morning, the war with Iran has exposed a major vulnerability in one of the world's most vital interests, AI data centers.
CNN Business senior reporter David Goldman joins us now for part of our Decoding AI series. So, David, how vulnerable are these data centers?
They're very vulnerable, and I think Iran is proving that over the course of this war. There were attacks in Bahrain, there was an attack in Tehran, there were attacks in the UAE. 5 confirmed data center attacks just over the course of the last few months, and this exposes these data centers as sitting ducks in a war. I mean, just look at Bahrain. This is the Amazon data center that was attacked twice. First, on April 30th, we had that initial attack, and Iran said, we're not done, we're going to hit it again. Just a few weeks ago, there was a second attack on these facilities, Amazon now has a basically destroyed data center in a region that is increasingly critical for AI. We'll get to that in a minute. But, you know, these targets aren't exclusive to Amazon. Also, Google, Microsoft, NVIDIA, Palantir, all of these are targets according to Iran. They actually said that there are 29 different targets around the region for US-backed data centers. This is becoming an increasing problem. The reason that Iran says that these are all targets is because they are doing business with the US military. So a number of these companies, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, they are all part of a $9 billion military contract that goes through the end of 2028. And they're saying, well, you don't differentiate between military data that's stored in these data centers and commercial data like AI, you know, ChatGPT, that kind of thing in the data centers, and they make them legitimate targets. That's according to Iran. Now, the Gulf states have a say in all of this too. They have invested $2 trillion in US-backed data centers in this region. Kuwait, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, Oman, all of those countries have said that they want US data centers. They have a lot of money to spend on this. They want to become a kind of third choice between Silicon Valley and China. As this develops, this is going to be an increasingly important situation to watch, because if these data centers are sitting ducks and they're just attacked, well, then there's a new front in the war that needs protection, because these are critical infrastructure, not only for the Gulf region, but also for the United States.
Right, Palestinian sources tell CNN the White House wants Israel to stop its attacks on Gaza.
The second hour of One World starts right now.
A definite ramp up in Israeli attacks over the weekend. It came, only hours after President Trump announced what he described as a historic agreement.
Israel says they will continue to thwart any threat from Gaza.
Homes are being leveled, families are being evacuated, and fires are expected to burn for weeks. Now, a little bit of good weather could make an impact.
And later, a return to the pitch. Jason Sudeikis on Ted Lasso's new challenges in the hit show's 4th season.
All right, coming to you live from New York, I'm Zain Asher.
And I'm Bianca Goldrigo. You're watching the second hour of One World. Iran says that it has no plans to hold talks with the U.S., despite President Trump's claim that negotiations would resume today.
Yeah, speaking to reporters aboard Air Force One on Sunday, Trump said he called off a massive attack on Tehran, saying progress was. One day earlier, the president vowed to hit Iran hard until its leadership couldn't take anymore. Just a few minutes ago, though, Trump again took to social media, lashing out at the Iranian regime and casting doubt on its ability to strike a deal.
Tehran, meanwhile, says that it is holding discussions with Oman on a new temporary route through the Strait of Hormuz.
As Israel intensifies its strikes in Gaza, the top diplomat overseeing the Board of Peace is slamming the deadly attacks and urging de-escalation. A source says that Nikolai Mladenov met with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu today to discuss an agreement announced by President Trump last week that would disarm Hamas and lead to the phased Israeli withdrawal from Gaza.
And while Israel has not publicly responded, one official says the IDF will not retreat from its current line in Gaza. And Hamas says it will only comply if Israel halts its fire. Israeli strikes killed 28 people in Gaza over the weekend. The IDF says that it was targeting Hamas commanders. Well, officials estimate more than 1,200 Palestinians have been killed in Israeli strikes since the October ceasefire. CNN's Jeremy Diamond joins us now live in Tel Aviv. So much was made about optimism when this deal was announced on Friday. A lot of skepticism, too, given the players, specifically that Hamas said that it would lay down its arms. Now there appears to be a game of chicken in terms of who blinks first. Jeremy, what are the Israelis saying?
Yeah, well, Bianna, on Friday, as you know, when this agreement was announced and came to light, Hamas started talking about it in very clear terms, where they said, yes, we've agreed for the first time to this plan that would see Hamas relinquish their weapons. But at the same time, they also made clear that they were only going to begin this process of disarming if Israel first carried out a series of its own obligations under this ceasefire agreement, namely stopping the near daily Israeli strikes that we have seen in Gaza since this ceasefire began back in October. And instead, what we saw from the Israeli military over the weekend was a very clear ramp up in attacks on the Gaza Strip. At least 28 people were killed, according to the Palestinian Health Ministry, by these Israeli strikes since President Trump announced this deal in the early hours of Friday morning local time here. And the Israeli military said that in these strikes, it was targeting Hamas commanders and militants, including some who were involved in the October 7th attack on Israel. Today, what we've been seeing is a diplomatic effort to try and bring Israel back into compliance with this agreement. Nikolai Mladenov, the High Representative for Gaza on the Board of Peace, who works very closely with the U.S. administration, he met with the Israeli Prime Minister today, and I'm told by a source that Mladenov was there to speak to the Prime Minister about implementing this deal going forward, and included in that was a request for him to stop these Israeli strikes that we have been seeing in Gaza. Now, it's important to note that we haven't seen any additional strikes in Gaza since yesterday evening, and so the question is, was this ramp up something that the Israelis were doing in order to carry out several additional strikes before they would agree to the halt that the U.S. and the Board of Peace are asking them to, or is this simply more of Israel defying this ceasefire agreement going forward? We will get the answer to that in the days and weeks ahead, but it is important to note that amid this meeting between the Prime Minister and Nikolai Mladenov, the High Representative for Gaza, an Israeli official told reporters today that Israel would continue to thwart any threats that it sees in Gaza, and also that Israel would not withdraw from the current yellow line, meaning where the yellow line stands now after Israel seized additional territory beyond what was agreed to in that October ceasefire agreement. So a very, very delicate situation, and one that U.S. and Board of Peace officials anticipated would be quite difficult even after securing this agreement with Hamas following months and months of negotiations. They know that what lies ahead is going to be even more difficult, even trickier to accomplish, but that is the task at hand. Bianna?
Jeremy Diamond in Tel Aviv for us. Thank you.
All right, let's take a closer look at the situation in Gaza with Gaith Al-Amadi. He's a senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He's been an advisor to Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas and is a former Palestinian negotiator, and joins us live now from Washington, D.C. Gaith, thank you so much for being with us. So just talk to us about where things go from here, because we have a situation whereby Hamas is only agreeing to disarm if, of course, Israel stops any sort of future additional strikes. And at the same time, the Israeli military essentially saying they're not going to withdraw from Gaza at all unless Hamas disarms. So where do things go from here? I mean, this is a very sort of tricky, complicated thing to achieve here.
I mean, let me start maybe with the positive. I think the agreement itself is significant because the whole process since signing the ceasefire last October has been stuck. So this is injecting some diplomatic energy. However, we have two sets of problems here. The first set is, frankly, neither Israel nor Hamas want to implement their part. So how can you diplomatically push them in that direction? And the second set of problems is, even if there's diplomatic will, the reality on the ground just doesn't yet support implementation of this. You know, the deal asks for an international force to come in. The only number we have right now is 200. That's meaningless. But more importantly, it asks for 5,000 Palestinian soldiers to come in. And none of those soldiers has yet been recruited or trained. So we have a lot of challenges, but at least we see movement where just a few days ago, things were completely stuck.
Keith, it's, I guess, a bit refreshing to start the show with some optimism. Typically that comes from Zain and myself, but it's great that it's coming from a guest who knows more of these players than even we do here. As it relates to what you just mentioned, and that is the international force that at some point would be coming in and overseeing affairs in Gaza, it has long been understood that they would never agree to something like this, and most of these would be Arab and Muslim countries that would be sending their peacekeepers unless Hamas disarms as well. So where is their position in all of this? Has anything changed on that front?
Not really. I mean, when I talk about 200 people committed, they're mainly from Morocco. And if you look at the details, they actually are saying, yes, we're committing, but we're not going to go in and disarm Hamas. We might stay around the perimeter, etc. So this is all maybe diplomatic speak. But unless we see a real progress on Hamas disarmament, it's very hard to see how any external actors will come in. On the other hand, Hamas is saying we're willing to disarm, but Israel has to meet its own obligations. And Hamas knows that Israel right now is an election season. They're going to have an election, I think, October 27th, and unlikely to move on any of these fronts. This is where I think today, the meeting that Mladenov, the Board of Peace envoy with Netanyahu, is very important. Because we need to see sustained pressure on the Israelis to do their part, but also on Hamas. And pressure on Hamas has to come through pressuring their supporters, mainly in Qatar and Turkey. So a lot of complicated diplomacy ahead of us.
I mean, it's interesting because you answered my my next question, but I'd like you to expand, because this idea of sort of pressuring the Israelis to do their part is, as you point out, going to be very difficult, given that it's an election season for Israel, an election in October. Netanyahu faces a tough re-election battle. He's supposed to be the sort of security prime minister. And also, there's going to be a lot of pressure within Israel from his right-wing coalition parties who really want to make sure that the pressure is kept up on Hamas and, of course, on Hezbollah as well. So how does that resolve itself?
It's hard to see how it resolves itself. Partly because it's not only, by the way, the right-wing members of his coalition. Just a few minutes ago, two of their ministers said they want to re-vote on this issue. So we're seeing that pressure. But also his opposition. I mean, his key opposition figure, Gadi Eisenkot, political moderate, but a security hawk, came out against it and said this is going to keep Hamas in power. Now, Netanyahu, though, this is one set of pressures. But the other set of pressures is coming from President Trump, because Netanyahu just does not want to say no to President Trump. He does not want to go on his bad side. Yes, President Trump's popularity in Israel has diminished recently. Yet for Netanyahu, there's a lot of political cost in going for that fight. I suspect what we will see, Netanyahu trying to thread the needle. I mean, uncharacteristically, by the way, Netanyahu has said nothing as of yet about this directly. He's going to try to thread the needle, hoping that Hamas will save him by doing something outrageous and maybe excusing any of his actions.
Well, Netanyahu, I don't think, has said anything after President Trump seemingly put words in his mouth, surprising him with that announcement over the weekend that the United States would not be attacking Iran, even though it did seem as though Israel, at least, was planning that the United States would. But as it relates to Gaza, what we've seen from this administration time and time again are sort of these big announcements, a lot of optimism surrounding them, and not much follow-up. What do you expect to see now to make sure that this case perhaps is an outlier? Does it need to be the appointment of one point person who will be in charge of all of this? Because between Israel and Hamas, I can't imagine you think this is going to work itself out between them.
Absolutely. You need an American, senior American who is fully in charge of following the day-to-day implementation of this. Today, we don't have anyone like this in the U.S. system. Yes, you have Steve Witkoff, but he is very sporadic. You need someone who's doing it day-to-day, because without that, I have a lot of respect for Nikolai Mladenov. He is probably one of the most accomplished diplomats I have ever dealt with. Yet, without having clear, direct American support, there's only so much Mladenov can do. So if we don't have an American American in charge, it's hard to see how this is going to continue. And by the way, this is not only a problem when it comes to Gaza. I mean, I think there's a larger image problem for the U.S. in the region. Big announcement, no follow through. If we don't follow through on this one, I fear that the American standing and effectiveness in the whole region will further diminish.
All right, threats followed by reversals. More now on our top story. The U.S. president calling off what he says would have been a massive attack on Iran. Donald Trump claims peace talks between Washington and Tehran will resume in the coming hours. Iran says that there are no negotiations due to take place with the U.S., but it is in talks with Oman to establish a temporary corridor for vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz. This is Iranian state media report. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi spoke with senior Saudi and Pakistani officials Sunday night, and President Trump just posted on social media writing that nothing gets through to Iran unless we want it to, and nothing will get through unless a deal or total surrender is accomplished. In his latest piece for CNN, Stephen Conson writes, as he wrestles with the monumental and the absurd, Trump forgets what voters actually want. Stephen joins us live now from Washington. So within this social media post that my producers just read to me during the commercial break, you had essentially Donald Trump admitting that the Iranians are actually only going to be discussing with Oman at this point, that perhaps there might not necessarily be negotiations taking place today after all. And we are used to this sort of seesaw, this whiplash, Stephen. On the one hand, you have the US president saying, listen, I was planning to attack Iran, but I'm not going to. I'm going to de-escalate because there are going to be talks, and then inevitably something happens to derail those talks. This is exactly what a lot of us were predicting. Just take us through what we actually know so far about whether or not there are going to be negotiations taking place between the US and Iran.
Yeah, there's been some reporting this morning that the US was involved in those talks with Oman. That seems to be ruled out by the president in this post. I think what this Truth Social post shows is strategic confusion, frustration, the fact that Iran seems to be calling all the shots in this showdown with a far more powerful country, the United States, and that the president has got himself into a situation in a war that he started, which still, as we go into the 6th month, doesn't seem to have a way out that will either fulfill his goals when he started the war or be palatable to him politically or diplomatically. He starts off that post by saying that Iran and its leaders are duplicitous. That's exactly what Iran has been saying about the United States, not just in the way that Trump often breaks off diplomacy and then tries to use military force to coerce it to surrender. But some people I've talked to who've been talking to people in Iran basically argue that Iran now believes that there's not a great deal of point in diplomacy because anything that it agrees to will be countermanded by the president's volatility. And so basically we're in a situation which would have been hard to countenance before this war, that Iran's word seems to be just as good as the president of the United States' word. And I think that tells you a lot about American foreign policy at this moment.
Yeah, that is such a good point. So we are in August now, right? We've only got a few months left until the midterms. This appears to me to be a sort of fork in the road moment whereby if the war was to end in the next couple of weeks and perhaps America is deemed as the most successful party, I'm not sure how that's going to happen, but for argument's sake, you could argue that there is enough time for voters to put it behind them and sort of forgive this is a president that did say no new wars, etc., but perhaps there's enough time where the voters might be distracted in terms of focusing on other issues, and this will be sort of relegated to the past. As you get into September and October, Stephen, it becomes a lot more tricky. I mean, the president has a very narrow window to end this war before it does really start to have an effect on the midterms.
Yeah, and there's quite a lot of political science literature that points out that voters tend to make up their minds who they're going to vote for in November over the course of the summer. And it's quite hard after that, especially in a midterm election where you don't have big events like presidential debates, to change the narrative. Obviously, Iran understands that as well. They've shown themselves to be quite shrewd during this war in trying to build political and economic pressure on Trump. Perhaps they're believing that the president will climb down because he's so desperate to get this war over. The problem, I think, is that as if this blockade, the U.S. blockade and the effective Iranian control of the strait continue for much longer, you're then going to see some of the really serious consequences build that didn't happen when the war was put on hold the first time. You know, a lot of oil reserves are quite depleted around the world. We're getting closer to the European winter. Those countries in Europe don't keep typically a lot of natural gas in reserves, so they're quite affected by the volatility of supply and prices. So that could build economic pressure. If the high gasoline prices in the United States continue through September and October, you know, that's just going to make the president's argument that he's made everyone's lives better economically more difficult domestically. So all of these pressures are building. So you can understand why that frustration is coming through Trump's Truth Social post. But how to get out of this absolute mess doesn't seem any more clear now than it did 3 months ago.
So what are the wins? Because that is going to have to be his focus. I mean, just like any president during the midterms, he has to focus on this idea of, look, my party has made your life better over the past 2 years or so. What are the wins that he's going to focus on? I mean, obviously, I imagine that immigration is going to be one of them, but just take us through what the president is going to be touting here.
Yeah, and he often talks about how he's secured the southern border. That is true. The problem is on immigration, some of his harsher deportation tactics have started to turn away some voters who turned to him on immigration 2 years ago. Seems to have weakened his support among critical Hispanic communities in some battleground states as well. One of the problems is Trump doesn't really concentrate that much on the wins that he has. He doesn't talk that much about higher than expected tax rebates that a lot of people got this year because of his economic policies. The Trump RX website, which is designed to lower prescription drug prices in a fairly limited but still genuine way. He argues that because the stock market is soaring, or has been, that America is in a golden economic age and everyone is feeling great. The problem is that the evidence of most people's lives with higher prices, it's very difficult to get housing for many people, for younger people to get on the housing ladder. Grocery prices are still high. All of those things play into this fact that people are not feeling economically secure. And after all, they brought President Trump back into office, many voters in those key battleground states that he won over Kamala Harris, because they thought that he would bring down prices and strengthen the daily economy rather than the bigger economy as reflected in the markets and everything else. So there's a feeling, I think, that the president hasn't delivered on his policies in 2024, and that is at the root of his problems. And the Iran war, with all the extra economic consequences that it's causing, is only compounding those issues, threatening higher inflation and higher prices and gas prices and everything else, which a lot of people feel.
Iran's foreign ministry denies that any talks with the U.S. are currently taking place and says that Tehran is in discussions with Oman over a temporary safe route through the Strait of Hormuz. That comes after just hours after U.S. President Donald Trump told journalists aboard Air Force One that negotiations would, in fact, resume today.
They said, we'd like to make a deal. Now, I don't know what they say, because a lot of times they'll say that to me and then they'll go out and say, we don't know what he's talking about. Obviously, they don't want to be attacked. And they knew the extent of the attack because they saw it forming.
What happens now?
Well, now what we're doing is we're talking to them in the form of a negotiation. It begins tomorrow afternoon, and we'll see if it's true. I'd love to do that, save a lot of lives, save a lot of unnecessary power, to be honest with you.
Trump said the U.S. was ready to unleash, quote, military terror, strength and power not seen since World War II. But as he has done repeatedly, the president called off a threatened attack, saying that progress was being made on a deal that would reopen the Strait of Hormuz as well as end Tehran's nuclear threat. Iran, for its part, appears unfazed, instead focusing on talks with Oman on how to manage the Strait of Hormuz. CNN's Elena Treen joins us live now from the White House. So, Elena, we've seen this back and forth, this sort of seesaw before, whereby you have the president threatening something huge in Iran, then backing off, saying that there's going to be negotiations, that there's going to be talks, usually also sprinkling in there the fact that Iran is begging for a deal, in his words. Just explain why things are different this time, Elena.
It's not entirely clear that they are, I'd argue, Zane. I mean, we are in a place where we've seen now the same kind of thing play out over and over again. The president threatening these types of attacks just to pull back. And I think one of the key things that we've seen remain unchanged is that depending on who you're listening to, the U.S. versus the Iranians, you're getting a very different picture of what they believe is moving forward. As you mentioned, the president continuing to argue that negotiations are back on track, that they're going to begin this afternoon to discuss not only the Strait of Hormuz, but also what he's calling the denuclearization of Iran. And the Iranians arguing, no, that's not happening. They say that they are having talks with the Omanis about a temporary agreement to get the strait back open and have safe passage of different vessels. But they're arguing that they're not negotiating with the United States. I guess perhaps one of the things that is different is why we saw the president call off what he was previewing last week, which would be a major attack on Iran. They were expecting to have major strikes on Iran, the U.S., over the weekend, but he pulled out of that after having conversations with many different Middle Eastern allies, countries like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, and Iran, all of them kind of speaking with the U.S., trying to convince them to pull back from those attacks. One, worrying about retaliation for their own countries, but also, of course, arguing that it could get in the way of potential negotiations. And this is something actually President Donald Trump addressed while traveling back to the Washington, D.C. yesterday on Air Force One. Listen to what he said.
We're all set to go, but when the allies ask to call it off, you got to sort of say, well, let's see. And the reason they asked is I think there's a deal. There's a deal on Hormuz, and then there will be a deal on the nuclear, or you might call it the denuclearization of Iran. I call it the denuclearization of Iran.
A few things I'd point out here, Zane, is one, there's no question that it still remains the key objective and hope, really, of the Trump administration to find some sort of negotiation to end this war. They do want the fighting to cease, but of course, we've seen them try and fail at that many different times. It's unclear how this time will be different, especially after all of the attacks we've seen exchanged in recent weeks, degrading the trust between the key negotiators on both sides. So we'll have to see whether or not these talks actually do proceed as the president is previewing, and whether or not they can actually result in a substantial change as they look ahead. Unclear, but one thing that is clear is that many partners in the Middle East do not want these strikes to continue, and they also want to find some sort of diplomatic solution out of all of this.
All right, Elena Treen, live for us there at the White House. Thank you so much. All right, let's bring in Tuluse Olorunnipa. He's a staff writer at The Atlantic. He joins us live now. So as Elena was saying, it's not entirely clear why or if things are going to be different this time, or whether or not these negotiations are going to proceed. Talk to us about why this war has not worked out the way the United States would have anticipated and predicted on February 28th.
Well, it does feel a little like deja vu. Once again, the president is saying there's a deal in the works, and that he's pulling back from some major strikes that he had planned. And the Iranians are saying, wait a minute, we do not agree to have these discussions, or we do not agree that there's some big deal happening. Right now, the reason this war has continued on for months on months is because President Trump thought this would be an easy victory, a total victory, and that Iran would come to total surrender. And that is just not the way the Iranians work. It's not what they see as their best prospects in coming up against the great superpower of the United States. President Trump has seen some of the limitations of the American military. A lot of the stockpiles of military assets have been dwindled during this war. And the Iranians see some of the weaknesses that are on full display because of the way that President Trump has tried to move forward with this war. And so that's part of the reason this has taken so long. It's part of the reason the president's idea of a 4 to 6 week excursion that would come to an end with a complete U.S. victory has not been the case. This has been much more challenging for the president than he thought possible when he first launched this war. And the Iranians have not been willing to capitulate, and they've been willing to hold fast to their pretty hardline demands. And that is part of the reason why we've not been able to find some kind of resolution over the past several weeks.
Yeah, I mean, not only are they not willing to capitulate, but all the sort of threats seem to have the opposite effect. It sort of makes them dig in their heels a little bit deeper. And the one thing that this president is used to is that he's used to sort of making threats, and then the other party either cowers, surrenders, sort of finds some kind of way to negotiate. The way the Iranians are working this is very different to what this president is used to. So my question to you is, if he knows that, we've all sort of seemed to learn that over the past 5 months or so, why does the president continue to try to use the same tactics?
Well, he's the same man that he's been for the last 50 years or so. He's thought about American power in the same way. He's thought about using the full force of American leverage against foes and allies alike to try to extract victories from them. And so he's struggling to realize that those strategies aren't working the way that he envisioned, and the way they, to be honest, they have worked in some cases with other countries where he's imposed tariffs or he's threatened major threats, and he's seen those other countries either capitulate or come to the negotiating table and maybe not give him 100% of what he wanted, but gave him 50 or 70% of what he wanted, and he has been able to spin those into wins. Iran has not played by those rules. They're not willing to give the president much of anything of what he's called for, and instead they're pushing back in a very significant way, closing the Strait of Hormuz, challenging the president when it comes to his domestic politics by challenging the U.S. economy and raising the price of oil and the price of goods. And so that's part of the reason the president has continued to go through this loop of saying we have talks and we're right on the verge of a deal, and then basically saying I'm going to go back to bombing again because I can't trust the Iranians. We've seen that loop happen 3 or 4 times just in the last couple of months, in part because the president is relying on an old playbook. It does not seem to be one that works very well with the Iranians, but it's what he has, is what he has in his toolbox, and it does seem to calm the markets, at least for the short period that the president seems to be focusing on as he thinks about winning the day or winning the week. And that's part of the reason why we see this repetitive approach of the president saying we're just on the verge of a deal, seeing the oil markets calm down and the stock market go up, and then inevitably some weeks or days later the president's back to threatening to bombing Iran back into the Stone Ages. And so we have seen this multiple times, and it's not clear that we're on a different pathway now than we have been in the past.
Obviously, we have just a few more months until the midterms. If you have a president who campaigns on no new wars, I promise you no new wars, and I'll end sort of the wars that America is currently embroiled in tangentially. And then that president later authorizes military action. And by the way, many would say that this military action wasn't necessarily even necessary. Under what circumstances are voters more likely to be forgiving?
Well, the president's voters have forgiven him for quite a lot. They've given him broad leeway and they've trusted him quite a bit. But that trust is starting to break down. And we have to remember that the president's voters do not make up a majority of Americans. The president's supporters do not, the people that are the diehard supporters do not make up enough to win the midterms. So he needs to win over independents. He needs to continue to have that coalition of some, Democrats and independents and diehard Republicans and even moderate Republicans who, in some cases, held their noses and voted for him in 2024. The president has lost a lot of those voters because he's broken that promise of no new wars, because he's launched this war, and because he's taken the focus away from the top thing that the American voter has said that they want the president to be focused on, which is affordability and the cost of living and the economy. The president has done things that have made those things worse, especially with this war and the fact that it's driven the cost of gas up, it's driven the cost of goods up, and it's been incredibly expensive to the taxpayer. And so it does beg the question for the president how he plans to turn this around with just less than 100 days to go before voters start voting. It doesn't appear that he has much of a strategy for that. It doesn't appear that voters are going to change their mind in any significant way between now and November. And because we've seen this repetitive nature of the war in Iran, it doesn't appear that we'll have some kind of major deal or resolution or nuclear deal, the kind of thing that takes months or even years to put together before the midterms. And so we could be in a place where we have elevated prices and a crisis in the Middle East on election day, and that could be very detrimental for the president's political stance as well.
President Donald Trump says the U.S. and Iran will resume negotiations on Monday after he called off a planned attack on Iran over the weekend. Here's what he told reporters on Air Force One.
Well, now what we're doing is we're talking to them in the form of a negotiation. It begins tomorrow afternoon, and we'll see if it's true. I'd love to do that. Save a lot of lives, save a lot of unnecessary power. To be honest with you, it'll take many, many years to ever build it back. If it could, I don't think it would be even buildable back.
President Trump also claims there's a deal on the Strait of Hormuz and that there will be a deal on the denuclearization of Iran, as he puts it. Tehran, for its part, is not backing down on its claim to supervise the critical waterway. State media reports Iran's foreign minister held several high-level phone calls with senior Saudi and Pakistani officials on Sunday. Our Julia Benbrook has the latest.
President Donald Trump said that talks with Iran will resume on Monday after calling off what he referred to as a massive attack. Officials had told our team leading up to this that the president was considering planning for new strikes against Iran and that included an option of going after Iran's energy sites. Now, Trump took to social media over the weekend to say that he was canceling that planned attack, but that decision was contingent on Tehran rapidly making a deal. I want to pull up that post for you now. In it, he said that the United States remains, quote, locked and loaded, but added, despite this, we have just been asked by Iran and other Middle Eastern countries to hold off any attack and that the perimeters of a deal has been agreed to. This move comes after Trump spoke with Saudi Arabia's crown prince, and according to people familiar with that conversation, there was a push for de-escalation and concerns were expressed about these potential strikes. Trump said that allies pushing for him not to go through with this did play a role in that decision. Now, he says that parameters of a deal are now in place. It's not clear exactly what that means, as we have heard him use similar language throughout this now more than 5-month-long conflict. As he traveled back to Washington from here in New Jersey, where he spent most of his weekend, he was asked specifically if there was a deadline to come to an agreement. Take a listen.
We'll just see how it is. We're ready to go anytime we want. Would I rather make a deal? I'm not looking to kill people, because people die. A lot of people die.
And it's important to note that throughout this conflict, we have seen Trump go back and forth between expressing hope for a diplomatic solution, a diplomatic breakthrough, and threatening further escalation. Julia Benbrook, CNN, New Jersey.
H.A. Hellier joins us now live from Cairo. He is a Senior Associate Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute for Defence and Security Studies. Appreciate you being with us.
My pleasure. Thank you, Rosemary. Always a pleasure to be on your program.
Thank you. Well, President Trump says the U.S. and Iran will resume talks in the coming hours, but only if the two sides make a deal rapidly. It's a very different tone to what we heard from the president on Friday, and comes after he cancelled plans to attack Iran. 5 months into the conflict, we have heard this before, of course, but this time regional leaders are urging him to de-escalate the war and get this done. So how likely is it that we'll see a deal come out of this, do you think?
Thank you again, Rosemary. As you pointed out, we've been at this point before, where the American president announces that he's about to strike Iran in an incredibly aggressive fashion, and then suddenly turns around and says, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to allow space for negotiations. And I know that there are many who see this as some sort of strategy on the part of the White House. I think it's actually much more ad hoc and spontaneous than that, and frankly, erratic. And this is why I think regional leaders have been pushing so much for negotiations, for de-escalation, for some sort of a deal, because they're, of course, the ones, their countries are the ones that pay the price for any escalation and any disruption further within the region. How likely is it? Frankly, that's all down to the next few days. The United States could easily turn around and decide we're going to strike. We have that on record multiple times over the past couple of years, where the U.S. was involved directly in negotiations themselves with the Iranians, and then abruptly called them off and struck, sometimes on their own, sometimes with the Israelis. And of course, you're correct that regional leaders have pushed against this at this particular time. They also made it very clear that they did not want a war at the beginning of this year in February. And they were overridden by the United States that listened to lobbying from the Israelis and also decided on the basis of their own calculations to go forward. So nothing is for certain, but I think that there's a growing realization within the Trump administration that force simply hasn't achieved what they wanted to with regards to the Strait of Hormuz or the nuclear program. And this may be the Trump administration simply coming to the conclusion that they can't do this anymore, and they ought to let the Gulf states take point on this.
And President Trump is also claiming that there's a deal on the Strait of Hormuz and another one on what he's now calling the denuclearization of Iran. But Tehran is still insisting it will supervise the strait. So what do you expect that deal will look like?
I think talk about quote-unquote denuclearization is frankly for propaganda purposes within the United States, if I'm quite honest. The JCPOA took many months to negotiate with the Obama administration. I find it highly unlikely that the Trump administration is going to get a deal on that anytime soon. And I don't think the Iranians are going to negotiate on that, quite frankly, anytime soon. When it comes to the Strait of Hormuz, there's a Venn diagram here that's extremely bleak because the United States, of course, is very keen to ensure that the Strait of Hormuz returns to the state it was in the status quo prior to the war, i.e. no control from the Iranians or indeed from other Gulf states. Whereas the Iranians are very clear that they see control over the Strait of Hormuz as being their main leverage point to apply on the international community, on the Gulf, to ensure that the Americans don't strike them again. I don't find this legitimate, by the way, but that's not really the point. I think that they do see it in that fashion, and they want to formalize it. The question is going to become more of one about how the Gulf itself can engage with the Iranians on this particular issue. It's very difficult because, of course, the Gulf doesn't want to recognize or formalize Iranian control over what ought to be an open and free waterway. But I don't know how many options they have here. The Omanis have provided different compromise situations, scenarios, dividing the strait into two, talking about voluntary fees as opposed to compulsory ones. And I'm not sure where they'll land in this regard. But it won't be the United States that is pole position in these discussions.
H.A. Helia, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Israel has expanded strikes across Gaza for a second straight day. The IDF says it targeted 2 elite Hamas commanders at Deir al-Balah, as well as military operatives in Gaza City and Jabalia. The escalation comes despite President Trump announcing fresh progress toward an Israel-Hamas ceasefire on Thursday. Hamas has said it is committed to disarming, but only after Israel stops its attacks. Palestinians also gathered in Gaza City on Sunday to mourn a man, his pregnant wife, and their 7-year-old son, who were reportedly killed in an Israeli attack on a residential building. Officials estimate more than 1,200 Palestinians have been killed in Israeli strikes since the initial ceasefire plan was outlined in October.
We do want to begin with President Donald Trump, who says that the U.S. and Iran will resume negotiations today after he called off a planned attack on Iran over the weekend. Here's what he told reporters aboard Air Force One on Sunday.
They said, we'd like to make a deal now. I don't know what they say because a lot of times they'll say that to me and then they'll go out and say, we don't know what he's talking about. Obviously, they don't want to be attacked. And they knew the extent of the attack because they saw it forming.
What happens now?
Well, now what we're doing is we're talking to them in the form of a negotiation. It begins tomorrow afternoon, and we'll see if it's true. I'd love to do that, save a lot of lives, save a lot of unnecessary power, to be honest with you.
And aboard Air Force One, the president also claimed that there's a deal on the Strait of Hormuz and that there will be a deal on the denuclearization of Iran, as he put it. Tehran, for its part, not backing down on its claim to supervise that critical waterway. In fact, state media reporting that Iran's foreign minister held several high-level phone calls with senior Saudi and Pakistani officials on Sunday. Let's go now to Nada Bashir, who joins me live from London. So, Nada, just tell us a little bit more of what we know about these negotiations before they begin.
Well, as you mentioned, Paolo, we are still seeing some daylight between the United States, the Trump administration, and Iranian officials, according to the messaging and rhetoric we are hearing at this point. As you heard there from the U.S. president, he seems pretty adamant that we are expecting to see those talks taking place today, another round of negotiations in an attempt to mediate some sort of diplomatic resolution. And that is certainly what Gulf allies of the United States and others in the region have been pushing for. Many of these nations, of course, bearing the brunt of this recent escalation, seeing yet more attacks from the Iranian regime, from missiles to drone attacks, targeting not only civilian areas, but also, of course, U.S. military assets in the Gulf region. And there has been a real push by Gulf nations and others in the region, including mediators in Pakistan, to try to bring everyone back to the negotiating table to try to prevent a further escalation. But in terms of what we're hearing from the Iranian regime at this point, it is that staunch, quite clear rejection of this attempt of negotiations, or the fact that they had called for a return to the negotiating table. We've seen reports, according to the semi-official Fars news agency, quoting officials within the Iranian regime saying that the Trump administration has run out of steam, that Iran has not asked for the attack to be called off, has not asked for negotiations to resume. We've heard further warnings as well from the Iranian regime, according to state media broadcasts and publications, stating that any further assault or attack by the United States on Iran will trigger, once again, a significant response from the Iranian regime. And that is, of course, the messaging and the rhetoric that we've been hearing on both sides now for some time now. But again, that effort by mediators, by others in the region to try to step up the pressure is ongoing. We know that Iran's foreign minister, for example, as you mentioned, has been speaking with officials in both Saudi Arabia, his counterpart in Saudi Arabia, as well as senior military officials in Pakistan, marking the second round of talks in just 24 hours on Sunday. So clearly we are seeing some sort of diplomatic movement there on that front. Of course, Iranian officials have also been maintaining communications with officials in Oman as well. And it's understood that those talks and discussions have really been focused on the mechanics of trying to hammer out some sort of agreement on how to control the security of the Strait of Hormuz in any sort of negotiated agreement. But again, both sides have been very clear on what they expect to see in any sort of deal. And up until this point, we have yet to see any agreements. And whether we do see talks today taking place and what form they may take place in remains to be seen.
US President Donald Trump again calling off the threatened massive attack on Iran, saying talks are resuming today. Iran, for its part, saying negotiations with the US are not happening now. Iranian state media report Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi spoke with senior Saudi and Pakistani officials on Sunday night, though, and the foreign ministry says Iran is in talks with Oman to establish a safe temporary corridor for vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz. So where do things stand at the beginning of this week? We've got Elena Treen at the White House for you. Elena, what are you hearing about the status of negotiations and where things may be headed this week?
Yeah, look, clearly, and we've seen this now multiple times throughout the entire course of this war, Becky, you're hearing one thing from the United States and the Trump administration and a different thing from the Iranians. But the president seeming to have an optimistic tone yesterday when speaking with reporters, said that talks with Iran will resume this afternoon. Iran, for their part, arguing that there's been no indication that that's going to happen and that they're solely negotiating with the Omanis. Now, this comes after, as you mentioned, Becky, that the president, who had been planning and had kind of previewed a massive attack on Iran over the weekend, called off those strikes, arguing, one, that he had spoken with several leaders throughout the Middle East. That includes speaking directly, we were told, with Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, and Iran. Those leaders telling the president that they were worried about the impact of such a major attack, what the retaliation would look like for their own country, countries, but also, of course, what it could do to the very fragile talks happening behind the scenes regarding this broader war. The president also, though, argued that there has been a deal, or parameters of a deal at least, to try and reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Iran, for their part, arguing there is no such long-term deal, that they are talking, they said, with the Omanis to have some sort of temporary solution to allow for free transiting of vessels in the strait. So very messy, and a lot of different versions of events depending on which country you were looking at and what you're hearing from the U.S. officials versus Iranian officials. Now, I will say, just to give you a little sense of more of what we heard from the president, he argued yesterday when speaking with reporters on Air Force One that Iran was willing to come to a deal on the strait. He said because they knew that there was going to be this major attack. He also confirmed that these different Middle Eastern countries had asked him to hold off. He said we were all set to go, but when the allies asked to call it off, they got us sort of saying, well, let's see. The reason is they think that there is going to be a deal. So a lot of questions here. I'd also remind you about the dynamics and the political dynamics really happening back in the United States. This war has now been started and stopped for weeks now, and it comes just 3 months now until the November midterm elections. A lot of uncertainty around the economy, and one of the biggest questions and problems facing this administration is something that wasn't a problem before this war began, which is, of course, reopening the Strait of Hormuz. So a lot that they still need to work through. Will be trying to figure out what the sort of talks that the president was referring to are going to look like this afternoon, and bringing the news back.
President Donald Trump says he has called off his latest threatened attack on Iran. He explained why to reporters on Sunday aboard Air Force One. Have a listen.
We're all set to go, but when the allies ask to call it off, you got to sort of say, well, let's see. And the reason they asked is I think there's a deal. There's a deal on Hormuz, and then there will be a deal on the nuclear, or you might call it the denuclearization of Iran. I call it the denuclearization of Iran.
Well, Iran today denying negotiations with the US are happening, but the foreign ministry says talks with Oman are underway to create what it describes as a safe temporary corridor for vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz. All right, look, let's get some analysis on this and try to work out where we are at. Zachary Cohen with us this hour. We're also joined in Washington by Stephen Collinson. And Stephen, let me start with you. This decision to pause US strikes came, as we understand it, after Gulf intervention, particularly from Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. We do keep seeing the same pattern, the escalation, followed by diplomacy, or at least talk of diplomacy, then a return, it seems, to confrontation. An official with knowledge of the situation has told me this hour that ongoing talks are directly between the US, Iran and Oman at this point. What do you make of where this conflict is and is headed at this point?
Well, President Trump's little excursion, as he called it, is now entering its 6th month. And it seems unclear as it was at the start, what the way out might be. As you say, we've had these repeated oscillations by Trump between massive violence and the threat of massive violence, and then, I think, overplaying progress or prospects for talks, which seem to indicate that he is the one that's desperate for a deal rather than Iran. This latest development, I think, does point to one possibility, and it's that countries in your region may be the only way out of this if there could be perhaps a temporary deal between Oman and Iran on the Strait. That might open the way for wider talks in the region about how to manage the Strait of Hormuz going forward. There's been a little bit of talk about this in the think tank community in recent weeks. But, of course, that would be only tackling the issue that was already solved before the war started, and that is the passage of tankers through the Strait. How we get from there, even if it happened, to talks about Iran's nuclear program seems very difficult to perceive, simply because Iran seems to indicate that it has very little interest in getting to those issues.
Donald Trump's latest, and let's call it a U-turn here, certainly his detractors will be calling it a U-turn in this Iran conflict, has added another chapter to a pattern that his critics have called TACO, short for Trump always chickens out. Now, you and I have spoken about this before, but I wonder whether you think that's a fair criticism of the president in this instance. Is this sort of effort to try and find a diplomatic off-ramp not better than the alternative, which is back to war at this point?
Yeah, and if Trump had gone ahead with what he said was going to be the most significant action since World War II, I mean, I think we can take that with a pinch of salt. But if he'd have gone ahead with these massive attacks over the weekend, everyone would now be arguing that the president is pursuing a war with no end in sight, risking lives in the US and Iran, especially among civilians, for no purpose. So, US history is full of examples in which presidents have used military force and escalated wars that seem to be lost just to preserve their own credibility. So that is one point about this. But the problem is every time Trump threatens escalation and then doesn't go ahead, he weakens American power, not just the perception of that power in Iran, but around the world. This way of waging war, which is erratic and volatile and doesn't seem to have any strategy, is what got him into this situation in the first place.
Zach, let me bring you in. Stephen touching on it, but I do want to discuss further the fact that in the past hour, an official has told me that the ongoing talks, and they exist, are directly between the US, Iran, and Oman. I'm feeling a sense of deja vu here. Before this conflict broke out, of course, 6 months ago, there were direct talks between the US, Iran, and Oman mediating in order to try and get a kind of comprehensive deal. Now it seems these talks are very specifically about the Strait of Hormuz. And of course, that waterway is, a key focus on this conflict. What do you make of what we're hearing?
Yeah, Becky, in a lot of ways, we've gone backwards since the signing of the MOU. We're now, as you mentioned, hyper-focused on the Strait of Hormuz, and that, as Stephen said, was open before Donald Trump and Israel started this war more than 6 months ago. And so what you're seeing now is the urgency, though. I'm also told that for the U.S. side, opening the Strait of Hormuz, trying to find some sort of a diplomatic negotiated agreement that would effectively reopen this waterway by securing a pledge by Iran not to threaten shipping that's trying to transit it is really the central focus here. And that does leave all the other objectives that Donald Trump has stated for starting this war still out there. And really a lot of uncertainty hangs over how and if he may go about trying to achieve them. And we're reporting today, too, that even the U.S. military is crowdsourcing new ideas for how to ramp up the pressure on Iran and taking a hard look at its strategy and the options militarily that it has available to the president in order to achieve some of these goals, and namely push Iran to the negotiating table on Donald Trump's terms. That's something he has effectively failed to do for multiple reasons to this point, and one that obviously the military is now sort of reassessing how they can better serve as a tool into that pursuit as well. But ultimately, too, Becky, we had some reporting recently about how part of the issue here is the question of who is actually in charge, who has the authority on the Iranian side to agree to anything with the U.S. or the Omanis. The IRGC, as predicted in this scenario by the U.S. intelligence community, has taken a very firm grip on power inside of Iran as of now. There's elements and different factions within the IRGC itself that raises concerns among Gulf allies. I know that this conflict could go on for a while because there isn't really one unified voice that speaks with authority for the Iranian regime. So ultimately, we'll have to see how this plays out there. But a lot of people asking themselves a lot of questions, taking a hard look in the mirror about how do we go forward here during a conflict that's gone on for 6 months longer than Donald Trump effectively laid out at the beginning.
Yeah, of course, he promised 6 weeks. We're now into the 6th month. I do, while we're talking, and I'm going to bring Stephen back in at this point, let's just bring up that graphic that shows the traffic in both the Strait of Hormuz, the waterways outside of that, and indeed the Bab al-Mandeb. Just look at that. There's a reason why these two waterways are absolutely key here. Just look at the amount of global traffic in those waterways and the importance of those two real chokeholds. The Bab el-Mandeb to the left-hand side of your screen, just there down at the point of Saudi Arabia and up there in the Strait of Hormuz. What you are seeing on your screen is why the focus is on these waterways. That is partly, to a degree, how the world gets, its stuff, its oil, its supplies, all the stuff that comes out of petrochemicals, and why it is that now we are seeing such a focus on getting these waterways free for navigation. Stephen, you write that, quote, Trump is juggling some of the gravest issues confronted by a modern president, like the war and some of most trivial, including a dispute over Washington's reflecting pool. Are you saying that his presidency is suffering from a genuine failure of strategic focus, or that Trump believes these cultural and symbolic fights are, equally as important as war and the economy at this point?
I think both are true. Both of them seem to hold equal importance in Donald Trump's mind and his political priorities. The scattershot way that he conducts his presidency, he can flip between all of these different issues, grave and preposterous and unserious as many of them are. I think that interesting thing that plays into this about that map is you saw those ships in those two waterways. Geography hasn't changed since the start of this conflict. It was pretty obvious to anyone that has only a thin, knowledge of this region that a war could easily block up these two waterways. And that gets to the question of why there was not more focus and more strategic planning by the president before this war started. And I think that is something that is reflective of his presidency as a whole. In a lot of these situations, Trump lashes out, he makes a gut decision. He doesn't necessarily think about the second and third order consequences of what he does. And that is why he has so many of these crises cresting at the same moment. If those ships stay in the waterway for another month, say, there are going to be serious problems with reserves, oil reserves, crude reserves across the world. We're getting closer to the European winter. Gas supplies are very important there because they don't keep a lot of liquid natural gas in reserve. Diesel prices will go up. That affects agriculture. All of this is happening as we're less than 3 months before a midterm election. So the political and economic pressure rising on Trump, I think, does partly explain why he might want to get out of this more quickly. The problem is Iran knows that. Iran knows the way the president has managed this war and everything else. And that is, I think, giving it the capacity to be the dominant figure that's controlling escalation in this conflict.
Let's go to this. This morning, the war between the U.S. and Iran is opening up a new set of targets like we haven't seen before. AI data centers are increasingly in the crosshairs. Iran has attacked several facilities across the Gulf region already, including an Amazon data center in Bahrain. The U.S. has struck an Iranian data center. These massive facilities power everything from cloud computing to artificial intelligence. Many are tied to major U.S. tech companies like Amazon and Microsoft and Google. These recent attacks are raising concern about the overall security of what's becoming critical infrastructure in the new AI era. CNN's David Goldman is looking into this one and joins us right now. What are you finding?
Yeah, these are sitting ducks in this war now. I mean, 5 attacks on AI data centers is a lot of attacks. And in fact, the one that you were talking about in Bahrain, that Amazon data center, that was the second time that that particular data center was attacked. So clearly, this is becoming a new front in the war with Iran. So the question is, what can be done about it? Well, Iran believes that these are legitimate military targets, and there's a good reason for that because Amazon, Microsoft, Oracle, Palantir, they all have a massive multi-billion-dollar contract with the government to do military work. But they don't differentiate between military work and their commercial AI. And the other thing is that there's a huge investment in that region. They wanted to become a kind of third choice between China and the United States. They have dedicated, these Gulf nations, $2 trillion to AI, and specifically US AI, to the exclusion of China. This is something that I don't think Iran is going to give up all that easily.
But what, I mean, it's also the United States, as you said, has attacked an Iranian data center facility. I mean, just like they need to be secured, especially in this new era we're entering. I mean, it's just the fact of the matter.
That's right. And these are big warehouses. You can't, prevent drone fire. The only thing that you can do is build redundancy. The question is, who is going to build in this region if this is going to continue?
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's good to see you, David. It's a really important and interesting aspect of this war we haven't talked much about. Great to see you.
We have exclusive new reporting this morning. Sources tell CNN that an officer in the U.S. Central Command's intelligence branch sent an email last week asking a broad group of military analysts for, quote, new creative and unconventional ways to pressure and punish Iran. A second source says CENTCOM is looking at everything, acknowledging it needs to reevaluate its strategy. So let's go live now to CNN national security reporter Zachary Cohen. Zach, how unusual is this kind of request?
Yeah, Pam, it's certainly unusual based on what me and Katie Bo-Lillis are told from our sources to see this sort of crowdsourcing effort being pushed via email. But it is one example, though, of the limited options that we've seen, the military options that are currently available to President Donald Trump as far as using the military to try to force Iran to the negotiating table on his terms. We've seen this conflict over the course of the last 6 months play out in a way that has frustrated the president because he is systematically attempted to try to force Iran through bombing to agree to his terms. And to date, obviously, it's gone the other direction. Iran is continuing to resist any sort of negotiated agreement with the United States. And again, the core problems that exist now are even beyond what existed before the war. The Strait of Hormuz remains an incredibly urgent problem for President Donald Trump, and that is one of the focal points of this crowdsourcing effort by U.S. Central Command, asking military analysts, military planners for creative and unconventional ways to ramp up the pressure on Iran, hoping to get some sort of a negotiated deal to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Now, we're also told that the U.S. military has been preparing options to potentially escalate the war. We saw that this email went out to analysts just days before President Donald Trump issued that threat of new strikes against Iran. Obviously, one of the options for escalating we have heard is that potentially targeting energy infrastructure, which would likely carry significant consequences if the U.S. were to take that route. So there is this reluctance to escalate while also this push by the president to finally find some sort of a way to end the conflict. And we brought this reporting to U.S. Central Command, and they said in a statement to us, U.S. Central Command has a long history of thinking and working in innovative ways. Admiral Cooper, in particular, reaches out to members of our great team, regardless of rank, to achieve the highest levels of operational performance possible. So we'll have to see if this effort does yield any sort of fresh ideas, but obviously the conflict's still a lot of uncertainty hanging over it.
All right, Zach Cohen, thanks so much for the latest there. Wolf?
All right, Pamela, happening now. President Trump says talks with Iran will begin today. That's what he says. Over the weekend, the president canceled what he called massive new strikes after an appeal from Saudi Arabia's crown prince to hold off on a new offensive.
We're all set to go, but when the allies ask to call it off, you got to sort of say, well, let's see. And the reason they asked is I think there's a deal. There's a deal on Hormuz, and then there will be a deal on the nuclear, or you might call it the denuclearization of Iran. I call it the denuclearization of Iran.
Iran hasn't publicly said it would be part of any talks today. With us now, Aaron David Miller. He's a former State Department Middle East negotiator, a senior fellow over at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Aaron, thanks very much for joining us. How much leverage or credibility does Trump have with Iran at this point?
I think he's really come up short, Wolf, in both departments. I just don't think they're happy endings here. I mean, I'm old enough to remember Vietnam. This is not Vietnam, but I remember what John LBJ said about Vietnam. He said he felt like a hitchhiker in a Texas hailstorm. He couldn't run, he couldn't hide, and he can't make it stop. And basically that is the president's predicament. Two unpalatable options: massive escalation against energy, civilian infrastructure, does not want to do that, or to accede to Iranian demands and concerns and accept a significant amount of leverage and control that the Iranians want to impose on the Straits of Hormuz. It is their new nuclear weapon, Wolf, and I don't think they're prepared to give it up.
The Saudis, we're told, pressured President Trump not to resume U.S. attacks over concerns their oil facilities would be targeted by Iran. How much sway do they have, the Saudis, with President Trump right now?
Oh, I think they have an enormous amount. And, you know, geography is destiny, right? Well, from the Middle East, I mean, they're so vulnerable, even though they're exporting, 3 to 4 million barrels of oil a day through their east-west pipeline into the Red Sea. The Houthis are now blocking and imposing serious constraints on the passage of that oil, which is where their Asian markets are. And look, there's also financial concerns on the part of the president. I mean, his son-in-law, his best friend, Steve Witkoff, they all have business ventures there. You know, for the Trump administration, Saudi Arabia is like an ATM machine. So they want to keep the Saudis as happy as they possibly can.
Certainly by delaying what Trump had said would be the biggest military assault since World War II. Now the president has decided to delay any such military assault that presumably makes the Saudis happy. Let me turn, Aaron, while I have you, to the sensitive issue of Gaza. An Israeli official tells CNN that Israel won't withdraw from its current lines in the Gaza Strip, the so-called Yellow Line. Why is that so significant?
Look, Wolf, let's be clear. The shadow of October 7 hangs heavily and darkly over Israelis. That's factor number one. There will not be any Israeli concessions on Gaza, particularly, and that brings me to factor number two, which is the political future of one Benjamin Netanyahu. In less than 90 days, October 27, he faces the most critical election of his political career. If he loses power, Wolf, it's possible he could be indicted. He's on trial for bribery, fraud, and breach of trust in a Jerusalem district court. Ehud Olmert, you know him well, as do I. One of his predecessors served 17 months for only one of the charges that Netanyahu is accused of. So he could be convicted or cut a plea deal that would force him out of politics. So he must remain in power. And part of that is keeping control over a right-wing coalition. Hard to imagine any flexibility, Wolf, on Gaza in the next 3 months.
So would the hardliners in Israel, Aaron, actually give way not only to this Gaza deal, but also have the Israeli forces get out of Lebanon and not attack Iran again?
You know, of the three fronts, I think that Netanyahu probably has the most flexibility in Lebanon. You have a million Israelis in the north who probably are angry at him for launching this war against Iran, which have exposed them to Hezbollah missiles. I don't see the Israelis withdrawing again in the next 3 months. There is this pilot project. You've got 6, potentially 7 rounds of really quite unprecedented negotiations between the Israelis and Lebanese. You have an Israeli-Lebanese government that's more risk-ready than any in the past. But again, we're talking about transactions here, Wolf, on these 3 fronts: Gaza, Lebanon, and Iran, not transformations.
Very quickly before I let you go, Aaron, have you ever seen U.S.-Israeli relations as strained as they are right now?
No. Jimmy Carter to Bush 43, I worked, no. You have a rare coincidence of public pressure, of congressional pressure, particularly from Democrats and increasing number of Republicans, and even executive pressure on Israel. It's unprecedented, Wolf. And for anyone who's concerned about the future of a reciprocal, healthy U.S.-Israeli relationship, it's really as fraught as I've seen it during the course of the last 30 or 40 years.
Yeah, good point. Aaron David Miller, thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me.
Pamela.
So, deal or no deal? President Trump telling reporters on Air Force One last night the U.S. military was, quote, locked and loaded. But he called off strikes on Iran because our allies asked him to, saying Iran was ready to make a deal. He says talks could start today.
We're all set to go, but when the allies ask to call it off, you got to sort of say, well, let's see. And the reason they asked is I think there's a deal. And they knew the extent of the attack because they saw it forming.
What happens now?
Well, now what we're doing is we're talking to them in the form of a negotiation. It would be the biggest attack since World War II, and it would have been disastrous for them.
Okay, we've seen some of this before from the president. He starts with a grim warning. This case, biggest attack since World War II. Before, it was to obliterate their power plants or to take control of Karg Island, and he backs down. So, can we trust that diplomacy will work this time around? Joining us in the group chat, Lieutenant General Karen Gibson, former Deputy Director of National Intelligence. Thank you so much for being here. So the thing that caught my ear in that statement is when he said, our allies asked, and then he sort of shrugged like, you know us, listening to allies. And I was like, really? So help me understand, what is it that they want, and who do you think had the leverage?
So I think certainly our Gulf allies are the ones who bear the brunt physically, who bear the risk for the counterstrikes that Iran conducts after each of or prior to our own escalation or our strikes against Iran. And I think they have been urging for some time that we prioritize diplomacy over the continued strikes, which frankly have had some questionable efficacy in terms of an inability to move the needle on the Iranian calculus.
All right, you're using national intel speak. What I hear is we're striking, we're using military, and it is not changing Iran's position fundamentally.
That's right.
So the military thing isn't working, but is the diplomatic thing moving the ball forward in any way? What are you going to be listening for in the next day or two?
So I think, one, we haven't heard yet what Iran has to say publicly about this. So some kind of public response there. I think that our allies, particularly folks like Qatar, and you asked who has the greatest heft or weight, I think it's probably the Saudis. There is credible reporting that they are the ones that compelled the president to stop. Remember Operation Freedom, which is where we were going to physically escort vessels through the strait.
Oh, yeah.
It lasted one day. There's credible reporting that it was the Saudis that convinced him to stop because they were concerned about attacks on their own infrastructure. And if I could pause for 1 second and say, I think what Iran has done in the last 10 days is shown that their power is not just concentrated on the Strait of Hormuz, but they have the ability to hit Gulf infrastructure as far as Egypt, the Red Sea, et cetera.
That tanker in Egypt definitely was eyebrow raising at that moment. And as you said, all of these allies, we strike, but they're the ones who get hit, right, from the counter push from Iran. There was some interesting reporting that CNN had over the last day or two that a senior officer in U.S. Central Command emailed, this is real, emailed a broad group of military analysts asking for new ideas in the fight against Iran, writing in an email, quote, "We're looking for new creative and unconventional ways to pressure and punish Iran." I love a good crowdsourcing. However, is this unusual? Help.
Well, crowdsourcing in that fashion is a little unusual, but certainly I could see where doing more of the same thing is unlikely to yield the results that we need. And so,
wouldn't the analysts have told them this stuff before? Like, help me understand how defense is working right now. That they just, this to me seems like a constant conversation that should be happening. You shouldn't have to check in a few months down the line and see if anyone's got thoughts.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is one email that we have. It doesn't mean that there haven't been similar conversations going on for some time, just because this is an email that has now come to light. I think military analysts should always and are always assessing how well is this working? What are our adversaries' vulnerabilities? Are we actually stressing those? And again, I think there's some question as to whether just continuing to strike in the way we have is going to do anything different in terms of the way the IRGC is looking at this. Their strategy all along has been to survive, avoid capitulation, and make the war so politically and economically untenable for the United States that we back off in some way. They don't have to defeat us militarily. They just have to survive the strikes. And they think time is on their side. They have a very high capacity for absorbing both economic pain and airstrikes. And I think they still think that they can win.
Can I ask you one more variable? As always, Israel. The chief of the Board of Peace will arrive in Israel. This is coming days after Trump said that Hamas and all other sort of groups in Gaza have to disarm. And over the weekend, Israel says it targeted a Hamas weapons storage facility in Gaza. left a crater and a hospital. Can you talk about how this back and forth, Hamas, Hezbollah, Israel, is going to affect this push to wrap things up with the war in Iran?
Yeah, so I don't think they have to be linked. I think Iran did link them earlier in the summer when they said a condition for us to sign the MOU is that Israel stop attacking Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. You know, Israel sees Hezbollah as an existential threat to them, and I don't think that's an ally that we can compel to back off.
Israel.
Correct.
Really?
Back off on Lebanese
But you hear
Hezbollah?
Netanyahu saying sometimes, like, well, look, we're going to understand the timing of President Trump and things like that.
Yeah.
I mean, at least publicly.
Yeah, but if they feel that their state is threatened, that their nation is threatened by Hezbollah and its weapons, I don't think they will allow Hezbollah to conduct attacks.
So will there ever be true Abraham Accords if this is the posture in all directions?
Well, there are Abraham Accords with some nations like the Emirates and Bahrain and
but I mean
others.
The new push
to
have
with the
other
Saudis.
countries.
Yeah, no, I think it would be very politically problematic for the Saudi Arabians to enter the Abraham Accords. You know, they occupy a unique leadership position in both the Arab and Islamic worlds as the custodian of some of the holiest sites without some kind of concession on the part of the government of Israel regarding the fate of Palestinians in Gaza or the West Bank. It really is impossible, I think, for them to normalize relationships with Israel.
It sounds like a diplomatic Gordian knot, to be honest. I'm glad you're here. Thank you for your help.
Now to the U.S. battle with Iran. This morning, President Trump says the U.S. and Iran will resume negotiations today after he called off what he said was going to be a massive attack on Iran over the weekend. The president saying he did it after allies across the Gulf region called and urged him to call off strikes because they believe a deal is within reach.
We're all set to go, but when the allies ask to call it off, you got to sort of say, well, let's see. And the reason they asked is I think there's a deal. There's a deal on Hormuz, and then there will be a deal on the nuclear, or you might call it the denuclearization of Iran. I call it the denuclearization of Iran.
Tehran, for their part, is pushing back against the notion of any deal in the Strait of Hormuz right now. With me now to discuss all this is CNN political and global affairs commentator Sabrina Singh and White House and national security correspondent for The New York Times, David Sanger. Thank you both for being here. David, let me ask you about this. After calling off what he said was going to be the biggest attack since World War II, President Trump says a deal with Iran imminent, having to do with the Strait of Hormuz particularly, and then saying ultimately it's going to be about the denuclearization of Iran as well. We've heard him talk about deals being imminent before. They had the MOU, that fell apart. Is there anything that leads you to believe that this could be true and will hold?
I'm certain, Sarah, that they believe that there is something that they can grab onto here. Whether or not it can hold is a completely different question. So what they're trying to do is basically solve the Hormuz problem first, which would then just get you back to where we were more than a month ago, right? When this 14-point memorandum of understanding was put together with deadlines about how they would go address the nuclear issues and other issues. Those deadlines are all gone now because they would have expired really by mid-August here. So the initial deal they're trying to put together is whether they can work something out in which Iran and Oman, which is just across the strait, work out a way for ships to come in, largely up on the Iranian side, and exit on the Omani side. And maybe they'll work that out, but the problem is that's not the kind of free, open pathway that the United States said it was looking for after the Iranians shut it down, which was only after the attacks began.
All right. Look, in the midst of all this, Sabrina, you have particular expertise in this area. We've got some exclusive reporting from Arzat Cohen that U.S. Central Command's intelligence branch wrote a message to a broad group of military analysts asking for what it called creative and unconventional ideas to punish Iran. Is this unusual for, the U.S. Central Command to sort of send out an email to military analysts saying, hey, give us your ideas on how to deal with this war?
Candidly, it's a bit odd. I spoke to a few people that work in the intelligence community when I saw this story, and it's a bit strange. I mean, that's usually something that you would keep a bit close hold with, senior officers. But I think this gets to the larger point of what David was saying, is that they are looking, and the U.S. military is looking for other options right now. The Strait of Hormuz is closed. I think it has been a successful U.S. military campaign against Iran in terms of degrading their capabilities. But unfortunately, Iran still maintains and retains a large swath of ballistic missiles and drones that can threaten the strait. And so I think U.S. Central Command is trying to look for other ways, maybe looking for leadership targets, trying to establish patterns of life, trying to get creative. But I think, candidly, yes, this is a bit unusual to solicit sort of a wide brainstorming session across a large group of people to get ideas of how to change the outcomes of this war.
David, does this give you a sense, just hearing this, that U.S. Central Command has sent this email out? I mean, technically, you'd think that the military analysts would be constantly talking and trying to get information and ideas back and forth. What does this tell you?
Well, the good news about it is that this is one of the first time that we have seen Secretary of Defense Hegseth's Pentagon actually reach out for some ideas that weren't generated just inside the military. So, they've been pretty reluctant for outside thoughts. They've been cutting back on their interchanges with academia and think tanks. So that's a plus. The downside is, I think it gives you a sense of the degree to which the president feels trapped right now. The fact that he could not go ahead with these strikes on Iran, particularly on Iran's energy sector, came because the Arab states come back and said the Iranians will respond by taking out energy facilities throughout the Gulf. And then where will we be? So to some degree, the president has really been deterred here. And, I know he's trying to wrap it up in we've got a deal coming, and maybe he does, and we all hope he does. But if so, it's now a two-step process, right? Get Hormuz open first, and only then begin to address the causes of the war, which are the nuclear and missile program.
All right, this morning, a CNN exclusive. The U.S. military reportedly crowdsourcing ideas for the Iran war, asking for, quote, creative and unconventional ways to put pressure on Iran. Let's get right to CNN's Zach Cohen, who has this reporting. So asking for help from whom exactly, and what kind of help here, Zach?
Yeah, John, sources telling me and our colleague Katie Bo-Lillis that the U.S. military is casting an unusually wide net as it's seeking new ideas for how to ramp up the pressure on Iran. And that includes this effectively a crowdsourcing email that was sent by a senior officer at U.S. Central Command to a broad range of military analysts. And it asks, quote, for creative and unconventional ways to pressure and punish Iran, which is notable in a couple of different ways. One, I'm told by multiple sources that a request for new ideas like this isn't necessarily a bad idea. Seeking input from a variety of subject matter experts, seeking input from a wide array of analysts who study this stuff pretty regularly is not necessarily a bad call by senior military officers. But at the same time, those same sources say that it does underscore this feeling that the President Donald Trump feels stuck by the limited military options he currently has. And we saw this play out as this crowdsourcing email was sent just days before Donald Trump was threatening new strikes on Iran, only to call them off over the weekend. He's now pushing this idea that talks with Iran are going to restart, but that's being disputed by Iran. And so the U.S. military is continuing to take a real look at its tactics, its strategy so far, and how it can help ramp up the pressure and potentially drive the Iranians back to the negotiating table. We've reported on multiple occasions that U.S. intelligence agencies have said that the kind of military strikes we've seen from the U.S. so far are unlikely to change Iran's behavior. And at the same time, we're seeing that play out in front of our eyes. The Iranians have shown little willingness to capitulate to President Donald Trump's demands. And so the U.S. military is taking it upon itself to seek input from a wide range of individuals within the U.S. military itself.
President Donald Trump says he called off planned attacks on Iran to pursue talks to open the Strait of Hormuz. But Iranian state media is giving no indication that its government has changed its position on the strait. Trump warned that the pause in attacks would only continue if there is quick progress in negotiations. Trump wants the strait, a critical shipping route for oil tankers, to be reopened and a, quote, end to Iran's nuclear threat. CNN's Claire Sebastian has more on how Iran and the U.S. got to this point.
President Donald Trump claims in his Truth Social post that he backed off his threats of escalation in Iran because the outlines of a deal have been reached. And because of that, he had been asked, he said, by Iran and other Middle Eastern countries to hold off on major new strikes to give diplomacy a chance. Well, Iran's state media reacted with glee and derision, giving no indication that the country had asked for the attacks to be called off. Trump also didn't mention which other Middle Eastern countries had asked for a delay, but that decision came just hours after he had spoken on the phone to the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, clearly alarmed at both Trump's rhetoric and Iranian threats of retaliation, particularly when it comes to energy sites in the region. Well, the Crown Prince urged Trump to, quote, prioritize dialogue to reduce escalation, according to a readout of the call published by Saudi Arabia's state news agency. Well, the other part of this is that the U.S. may also be concerned about Iranian retaliation. While the U.S. is still clearly the stronger power militarily, this war, now in its 6th month, has left it somewhat drained of military stockpiles. Its reserves of Patriot interceptors, for example, a critical defensive weapon, are down to about a third of their pre-war level, according to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And given the expansion of the war that we've seen over the past week, strikes on the Red Sea by the Houthis, a drone strike on an Egyptian port, Trump may be looking to avoid a cycle of escalation that risks getting out of control. Well, the halt in attacks is, Trump says, contingent on a deal being made, quote, rapidly. No specific timeline has been set, but this pattern of threats and then backing down has been repeated many times. And for the ultimatum to work, Iran has to believe that the US is willing and able to follow through. Claire Sebastian, CNN, London.
Claire, thank you. CNN national security analyst Alex Plitsis is joining us now. And Alex, Trump says they're making progress on this deal, though we haven't had any confirmation from Iran. And we've had progress before, 2 steps forward, a step back. What do you make of this current situation at this moment?
So we're still back to a disagreement over the 14-point memorandum of understanding that was reached with Iran, and it was over point 5, in which the Iranians believed that that gave them the ability to control traffic in the Strait of Hormuz. And when ships deviated from its declared patterns, they then fired on that, and we entered this escalatory pattern of violence. And so that was the real disagreement. And so over the last couple of weeks, the Omanis, and as we see there, the map that's up on the right-hand side, if you see that tip that's jutting out in the water, we see a whole bunch of red dots next to it. The tip of that is actually Oman. It's not the UAE, and that's the Strait of Hormuz. And so it became a question of, can the Omanis control the southern half, the Iranians the northern half, and that's where negotiations were left. What came out of that meeting was that the Iranian foreign minister was going to go back to Iran and see if he could get consensus to that plan where the shipping routes in the south would be controlled by the Omanis and Iran in the north. Iran responded a few hours later with missile strikes on boats, and then they fired on the GCC states nearby. Now they got back to the table, and there's a potential that the Omanis and the Iranians have now come to some sort of understanding, and then it becomes a question of tolling, because tolls are not going to be acceptable by anybody who's involved.
Okay, so let's talk about that. How likely is it to get Iran to a point where tolling is not something that's on the table and they give up control in that fashion of the Strait of Hormuz? How much pressure is on them to get them to the table, and what would be needed to make them relinquish control?
So there's really 2 points that have to be dealt with here. So the first is why they wanted potential tolls in the first place. So what I'm told by multiple sources in the region and from speaking to U.S. officials and others is that the blockade on Iranian oil was in fact working, and that we combine that with the damage from the war that's hit about 70% of the economy, plus the pre-war sanctions, they were being squeezed economically. And I was in Syria at the end of the year, at the end of August last year when the sanctions were being lifted. It takes a while to reintegrate the banks and everything else. So Iran needs a short-term cash solution to its problems. Tolls was one way to bring some money in right away, and then obviously potentially to have that money go to the IRGC where we wouldn't want it to go. The second piece is then how do you convince them not to do that? Well, there's economic incentives and things that are MOU that have worked out would provide them with liquidity and with cash. But the disagreement has been between the civilian negotiators and some of the security apparatus. When I spoke to some of the mediators in the last couple of days, they said, look, the double PhDs who understand international relations are the ones in the room who are doing the negotiations. They've then got to go back to Tehran and get a bunch of disparate groups of people from the IRGC, the Supreme National Security Council, who have different interests to agree to the terms that are being proposed. And many of them didn't want to return the strait to pre-war conditions. They wanted to hurt President Trump in that way politically, and they wanted to hang on thinking that they could extract more concessions from the U.S. That's where the disagreement lay, and President Trump had threatened additional military action if they didn't reach a consensus.
So, Alex, you're hitting on this a little bit, but when it comes to Iran negotiating, just how large is the gap, is the disconnect between what is happening with its people due to this conflict, the social, economic, the domestic issues, and its desire to inflict harm on the U.S.? How strong is that disconnect where they are or are not weighing on the economic policies?
So that's the issue, is that the Iranian regime is responding to an existential threat, because let's not forget the war opened with strikes on their entire leadership structure, taking out 80-something of the top people, including the late supreme leader. So they're still responding from an existential threat where their government is at risk. And until they get confirmation in their minds that this war is going to end, the regime isn't going to continue to be targeted, they're going to continue to respond in that fashion. And that's been part of the problem in terms of how they've been structuring their responses. And then they've got there's 4 lines of effort as part of their asymmetric strategy to combat the United States after speaking to regional sources. So one is to try to maximize U.S. casualties in the region. The second is to try to drive up the cost of goods, oil, and gas by choking off the Strait of Hormuz to put economic pressure on the United States. The third then is to go after the Gulf allies that they've been firing missiles and drones at to try to get them to put pressure on the United States. We did see a phone call from the Saudi Crown Prince that went to President Trump that may have contributed to the decision, because President Trump had threatened to attack energy infrastructure or at least infrastructure inside of Iran. Iran had threatened to retaliate against Gulf oil and gas. So there's a potential that was part of it. The last piece, or the fourth, was then to try to divide the president's base politically going into the midterm elections, because Iran knows it's at military overmatch. And so it's pressing on each one of those levers. And what we're witnessing now is part of that strategy.
Okay, you just talked about oil there a little bit. OPEC and its allies agreed to pump more oil in the coming months. Does that change the pressure, the levers of negotiations here on either side, whether it be Trump's calculations or Iran's, if gas prices and oil prices start changing as a result?
Yeah, so it's not just the money in that sense as well, because if there's a blockade and Iran's not getting any money, right, if that's not coming out and they can't receive cash because their oil is being blocked from leaving, and they may get trace amounts out, on the ground via Pakistan or other places if they have some illicit trade, it really is to satisfy the global markets, because if we can't get oil coming out of the Arabian Gulf, there's been an uptick in production around the world to try to make up for that in drips and drabs, a couple 100,000 barrels here or there to try to make up for that 20 million barrels that was coming out of the AG, as well as pipelines that were then redirected to move some of it over to the Red Sea. So it's really meant to try to satisfy, global demand. And because oil prices have been kept artificially low, especially at the beginning of the conflict by President Trump's reassurances to the markets, if you think about it, if gas got super expensive, that would sort of, quell demand. People wouldn't be consuming as much. But because prices were kept low, the demand was still there, but the supply wasn't. And that was the problem with the ripple effect with oil and gas not leaving. A little bit comes out, then it stops again. So OPEC is trying to increase production.
Okay. President Trump said in his post that, quote, Israel joins me in this commitment. Why haven't we heard anything from Israel or Prime Minister Netanyahu on this yet?
So that's the open question. And so far, the Iranians have chosen not to strike at Israel in response to the last round of escalations. They went after the Gulf states again, and they went after U.S. bases in the region, but they didn't go after the Israelis. I think, Prime Minister Netanyahu's made it clear he would prefer a stronger response. The Israeli political establishment, certainly not the IDF from what I'm hearing, would prefer to see this war through to its conclusion in their minds, because they think unless the Iranian regime is gone, this is not really ever going to end. But to do that is a very tall order. It's easier said than done. And so it becomes a question, do you want to stir that hornet's nest? But we are hearing, that what was put on pause was a potential joint strike between the United States and Israel, which would then start potentially another round of escalations. And if they fire ballistic missiles missiles at Israel again, that could, again, spark another round of escalations, and then it may not stop, which is the real risk that, that we would run. You mentioned earlier in the run-up correctly about the Patriot and other interceptor stocks being low. So there's a whole bunch of factors that go into that. Additionally, a lot of the Gulf states have been running offensive missions against Iran. Some of that has leaked out. There's been videos. You can't deny it when you see it, but it hasn't been public. And what I'm told is that part of that is because they didn't want to be seen siding with Israel during this. So if the Israelis were then to open another round of conflict, I think that would largely keep the GCC on the sidelines, and any retaliation for attacking their countries would continue to be done quietly.
All right. Alex Pleatis, appreciate your analysis, sir, as always. Thank you.
All right, new today, President Trump says he is canceling planned attacks on Iran after an appeal from Iran and other Middle Eastern countries. In a social media post, Trump warned it was contingent on a proposed deal being quickly agreed to. He says that deal calls for the Strait of Hormuz to be fully reopened and, in his words, bringing an end to Iran's nuclear threat. Iran has yet to make any official comment on Trump's announcement. CNN's Julia Benbrook is following this for us. Julia, what more is the president saying about his decision to hold off on attacks?
President Donald Trump, he said that he is canceling planned attacks on Iran, but that decision is contingent on Tehran rapidly making a deal. I want to pull up this post for you now. This came late Saturday evening, and it came after officials had told CNN that the president was planning for a new wave of strikes, and that among the options he was considering was to target some of Iran's energy sites. Now, in this post, Trump said that the United States remains, quote, locked and loaded, adding, despite this, we have just been asked by Iran and other Middle Eastern countries to hold off any attack, and that the perimeters of a deal has been agreed to. Now, this move comes after Trump spoke with Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, and according to people familiar with that conversation, there was a push for de-escalation, and concerns about these potential U.S. strikes were raised during that call. What's next here? Trump says that perimeters of a deal are in place. It's hard to know exactly what that means. He does say that any sort of a deal that is made would include the immediate reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, as well as the end to Iran's nuclear program. Now, we've heard language similar to this throughout this now 5-month conflict, as Trump has really gone back and forth between expressing hope for a diplomatic solution, a diplomatic breakthrough, and threatening further military escalation. Going back through these, one of the more recent times that he has canceled strikes was in June, in a post where he said that he was calling off those strikes because, quote, discussions and final points, both in concept and great detail, had been agreed to. It was a couple days later that the memorandum of understanding was signed. He has since said that he believes that that is off. So as of right now, we do not believe that there will be more U.S. strikes taking place this weekend. And Trump says that perimeters of a deal are in place. Again, hard to know exactly what this means as things move forward.
All right, new today, President Trump says he will hold off on new attacks on Iran as long as there will be quick progress on a proposed deal with Tehran. The pause comes after Trump said Iran and other Middle Eastern countries made an appeal to give diplomacy time to work. With us now is retired Army Lieutenant General Karen Gibson. She's also former Deputy Director of National Intelligence in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Great to see you. I mean, that the president would now call off these threatened attacks and saying, he talked to or got pressure from other Middle Eastern countries not to carry out these threats. How does this, in your view, either contribute to a credibility problem, not just with his adversaries or allies, or perhaps does this display a White House that wants to make a concerted diplomatic effort?
Well, it's a great question, Frederica. I think, throughout these last 5 months, there has been sometimes quite a whiplash back and forth between threats of imminent destruction and then the idea that we're on the verge of peace. And it does reflect some sense of urgency and a desire to end the conflict on terms that are favorable to us as quickly as possible. Any campaign like this has domestic political considerations, the price of gas, the threat of inflation, upcoming midterms, and a president who campaigned against forever wars. But that said, we haven't achieved the strategic objectives that we set out to achieve, to accomplish, specifically putting enduring curbs on Iran's nuclear program. And now, really for the last several months, we've been fighting to reopen the strait. The Gulf allies' concerns are real, and I think really driven in the last couple of weeks by Iran's demonstration that its ability to disrupt energy infrastructure across the broader Middle East is much greater than its ability to choke off the Strait of Hormuz, with the Houthi threat of a blockade down at the Bab el-Mandeb and drone strikes or other attacks against port facilities in Yanbu, Aqaba, and even as far as Egypt.
So what are the strategic goals? Because I feel like if you ask a variety of people, it's kind of lost on folks about what is the goal here, and is the United States getting any closer to its goal?
Well, the war was launched with an intent of enacting some enduring curbs on Iran's nuclear ambitions, and we are clearly not there yet. We have a more immediate goal, which is to restore normal commercial navigation through the Strait of Hormuz. And it's not just about navigation, but it's an ability to do business freely, again, across the broader Middle East. That is a more urgent objective, and it's really a precondition before we can even begin to address the nuclear-related issues.
And because there then seem to be a variety of goals, it means going about those goals is very different. There's a military strategy, a variety of military strategies, and a variety of diplomatic strategies. Do you see, are you optimistic about any particular route?
Well, let's talk about Iran's strategy. Iran's strategy is to survive, avoid capitulation. Let's remember, they see this as an existential fight for the survival of their state, at least the men who are in charge. That's how they see this. It's to survive, avoid capitulation, and to make the war so economically and politically untenable for the United States that we back off or ease up on some of the things that we are demanding of Iran. And I can't say that that hasn't worked yet. They truly believe that they have significant leverage, as they're demonstrating in the Strait of Hormuz and with these drone and proxy and missile strikes across the region, that time is on their side. And I think in order for our economic and military pressure to work, we need to convince Iran that time is not on their side, and that the longer this drags on, they will emerge eventually as an incredibly weakened, perhaps fatally weakened economically state. They need to understand that time is not on their side. If I could flip the script, that's the one thing I would change.
All right, we begin this hour with President Trump calling off planned attacks on Iran after an appeal from Iran and other Middle Eastern countries. In a social media post, Trump warned that canceling the attacks was contingent on a proposed deal being quickly agreed to. He says that deal calls for the Strait of Hormuz to be fully reopened and, in his words, ending Iran's nuclear threat. Iran has yet to make any official comment on Trump's announcement. CNN's Julia Benbrook is following all of this. So, Julia, what more is the president saying about his decision to hold off the attacks?
Well, it wasn't too long ago that officials had told CNN that President Donald Trump was planning for another round of strikes against Iran that could come as soon as this weekend. The president has now said that he has canceled those planned attacks, but that decision is contingent on Tehran rapidly making a deal. I want to pull up this social media post for you now. In it, Trump said that the United States remains, quote, locked and loaded. He went on to say, despite this, we have just been asked by Iran and other Middle Eastern countries to hold off any attack, and that the perimeters of a deal has been agreed to. Now, this move comes after Trump had spoken with Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, and during that call, according to sources familiar with it, there was a push for de-escalation, and concerns about these potential U.S. strikes were expressed. So Trump now says that the perimeters of a deal are in place, place. But it's hard to know exactly what that means because just on Friday, he had said that he had plans to hit Iran hard, that was a possibility. And when he was asked about the ongoing negotiations, the potential for some sort of a deal, he did not express a lot of hope. He said that he was losing faith in Iran's leadership and that they had just been making him angry. Take a listen to how he framed how those talks had been going.
I'm losing faith in them because they do lie and they do misrepresent. Well, the other day, the 5 missiles were shot. We knocked them down, but we were in the midst of a negotiation. I mean, I'm waiting for Steve to call me. How's the negotiation going? And instead, I got a call from Pete that they just shot 5 missiles at one of our bases in Jordan.
So where do things stand right now? Trump says that any sort of a deal would include the immediate opening of the Strait of Hormuz, as well as an end to Iran's nuclear program. Iranian state media has given no indication that Iran specifically asked for these strikes to be called off, nor that they have changed their stance on the Strait of Hormuz, which has been one of those key sticking points throughout this process. Fred?
All right, Julia Benbrook, thank you so much. CNN's Claire Sebastian has a closer look at how Iran and the U.S. got to this point.